Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our third and final webinar in our RemTech series. Thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that ESA respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, the Blackfoot, the Métis, the Nakota Sioux, the Iroquois, the Dene, and others, the Inuit, and many others whose histories, language, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community and workplaces. Today's webinar is brought to you by our good friends over at Core Environmental Consulting. Thanks to Sean and the gang for sponsoring today's webinar. Just some upcoming events. We have EnviroTech coming up in April in Calgary, esa.org/EnviroTech. Our new event, RemTech East, June 1st to 3rd at the Fallsview Casino in Niagara Falls. Call for abstracts is currently out, along with the sponsor and exhibitor information. And then RemTech will return in the fall in Banff as usual. So if you have any questions on those, please reach out to me. Recordings of today's webinar and the other two webinars are available online, and a link has been sent out for the other two and will be sent out again today at the end of this one for today's recordings and access to the other recordings, along with the presentations from today and the other two webinars. So watch for those in your emails, and thank you again. So we have 4, maybe 3 presentations. One of our presenters might not be available for the first set this morning, but we'll find out. And then we'll take a short break, and then we'll have 4 more presentations to wrap up today. So we're going to start with Jonathan Donahue with Equilibrium. And Jonathan's going to be speaking to us this morning on remediation case studies for salt impacted sites using recently released SST version 3.0 learnings and potential pitfalls. So Jonathan's just getting his presentation up, and then we'll get going. And then Jonathan just click the display settings box there. And then the first option. Swap presenter view. There you go. Yep. You're good. We just need your sound.
Hi everyone. Sorry about that. Just gonna go to the display settings again.
Yeah, you gotta put it back in presenter mode.
Okay. All right, can everyone see that?
Yep, we're good. We can hear you.
Okay, sounds good. So thank you everyone for attending this webinar session. Make some time for this, and I'll be discussing a few case studies focusing on remediation of salt impacted sites with guidelines derived from SST version 3.0. This presentation will discuss remediation of salt impacted sites using SST derived guidelines. Case studies will cover both a simple and complex site, and will be reviewed highlighting some of the learnings that were identified during these programs in both planning and execution of these remediations. It's important to understand that while topics discussed in this presentation cover a high-level overview of the subject, additional considerations may be applicable to different sites that this presentation may not cover. So the first case study is a former well site with identified tier 1 salinity and acidity exceedances within the routing zone, as well as elevated subsoil chloride, SAR, and sodium identified in the subsoil. This site, there was no co-contamination identified at the site during previous assessments. The constraining SST guidelines for the site are for the rooting zone and freshwater aquatic life pathways. The site was subdivided into two separate salinity impacted subareas identified by the red dashed line and the yellow dashed line. And that was done by grouping boreholes together based on magnitude and depth of chloride impacts, as well as identified similar chloride concentration depth profiles. A pre-remediation drilling assessment is recommended to be completed prior to an excavation to allow for refining of areas. This allows for submitting of samples for landfill analysis, obtaining confirmatory samples, and sampling potential backfill sources. Impacts identified during pre-remediation drilling or confirmatory sampling during a remediation may define or change the apex that in turn can alter the SST subareas. This is important because this can allow for more relaxed SST guidelines in other subareas if deeper, spatially greater excavation is required due to newly identified impact areas from alternative contaminants. Spatially greater excavations in SST primarily impact the aquatic life and DUA guidelines that are source and length dependent. This photo here was taken during the pre-remediation assessment where we were sampling potential backfill sources on nearby landowner property. A pre-remedial phase 2 assessment was completed to further refine the extent of the rooting zone Tier 1 EC and SAR impacts, subsoil salinity areas, as well as vertically delineate salinity impacts and obtain further background results for the SST model. This allowed for updated areas for SST guidelines. We obtained confirmatory analysis on walls prior to the excavation to allow for optimized stockpile placement, and this lower lab costs due to standard turnaround times. Important to note that any pre-remedial boreholes or test pits completed following topsoil stripping need to account for the topsoil removed. For example, if 30 centimeters of topsoil was removed prior to the pre-rem drill, it would mean samples collected would be representative of 30 centimeters deeper. Looking from left to right shows the progression of the site, information from historical identified impacts, supplemental phase 2 completed in the center, and pre-remedial phase 2 assessment, which further impacted or further defined the impact areas. Evaluation of backfill sources should be completed during the pre-planning phase of the program. Regardless of the source of the backfill, soil texture, salinity, acidity, and sap percentage are critical inputs for SST guidelines. Backfill soil qualities must be within all applicable guidelines. Soil texture, salinity, acidity, and sap percentage are suitable for backfill. Location of the backfill source and potential preparation and reclamation work required for using a source for a backfill, and potential trucking backfill on a backhaul if located near a landfill. A nearby landowner backfill source may be a good representative background soil for the conditions of the site and have some cost savings due to proximity. If landowner backfill does not substantially increase the size of an excavation or cost, it could be the preferred source location. Preliminary backfill options can be completed at a desktop level to determine how different backfill options may have an effect on the derived SST guidelines. For the 1 to 1.5 root zone depth interval, some subareas require remediation to more stringent criteria to provide a buffer that accounts for future upward migration of subsoil. Salinity impacts into the rooting zone as per SST protocols. If sufficient buffer is not available in terms of root zone quality, deeper subsoil excavation is required for the protection of receptors of concern. The SST root zone scenarios that require different buffers include impact at root zone and excavation backfill of root zone. The SST allows for different backfill and soil properties to be entered into the excavated backfill root zone scenario. The site is in the preliminary stages without a confirmed backfill source. Potential backfill options can be evaluated. The tables shown here show how the different guidelines would be affected based on different backfill scenarios. The column on the left is the different subareas, and the columns to the right represent the derived guidelines with the numbers in brackets representing the excavation required in meters. Often we'll run 4 backfill excavation scenarios. Backfill option 1 would represent EC and SAR and SAP percentage equivalent to the average values from 1 to 1.5 in background boreholes for the site. Backfill option 2 is SAP percentage is the same, and EC and SAR values are equivalent to the maximum values of EC and SAR that would not result in a more conservative chloride or sodium guidelines. Backfill option 3 that we'll run is EC and SAR values are equivalent to the average values from 1 to 1.5 in background boreholes, but the saturation percentage is 10% higher than average from 1 to 1.5. In backfill option 4, SAP percentage is 10% higher, and the EC and SAR values are equivalent to the maximum values of EC SAR that would not result in a more conservative chloride or sodium guideline. This allows for comparison of backfill options that may be available and could even result in reduced total excavation volume with associated cost savings. For example, for this site, backfill option 3 is where there's 10% increase in SAP percentage and EC and SAR are equivalent to the average values from 1 to 1.5. As seen on the bottom table, the required excavation would be 0.5 meter shallower than backfill option 1. By analyzing backfill sources beforehand, guidelines can be refined for consideration of the selected backfill source. Backfill quality, regardless, must meet SST requirements in terms of chemistry, texture, and should be reasonably close to the background areas for the site. Optimized backfill can be achieved by mixing 2 suitable backfill sources at a prescribed ratio to obtain backfill soil that is representative to the background samples at the site. If doing so, can only mix clean imported backfill source, cannot mix low-level salinity and salinity impacted soils with clean backfill for reuse. Conditions that could trigger an SST rerun. An SST rerun may be required, and if so, it's expected that changes in subarea dimensions and measured concentrations would not be expected to trigger an AER review for an SST assessment. It should be expected that contaminant subareas could change in shape and volume with pre-remediation drilling or during confirmatory sampling during the remediation. If the subarea shape has changed somewhat, but the depth of impacts and the area remains the same, it can be expected that no further SST reruns are required. The figure to the left is showing the pre-remediation drill plan for the subarea 1 and 2. To the right is the final excavation extent that was completed. Shape is slightly different to account for additional remediation for Tier 1 root zone SAR exceedances, resulting in no further reruns of the SST guidelines for this site. Once confirmatory results are obtained at the walls and the base of the excavation, preparation for backfill can be completed. This includes determining a flat level surface for the trucks to unload, sloping the sidewalls to allow for packing of the walls to minimize settlement, and survey transects across the excavation to ensure backfill is being completed to required contouring for the final elevation and ensure that no low-level salinity and acidity impacts are remaining within the root zone. The second case study that we'll look at is a former well site with identified Tier 1 salinity and acidity exceedances within the root zone, elevated subsoil chloride, SAR, and sodium concentrations. Additionally, the site has co-contamination in the salinity impacted areas with Tier 1 metals and Tier 2 hydrocarbon impacts. The site was subdivided into separate salinity impacted areas by defining areas with co-contamination, metal and hydrocarbons, as well as based on the magnitude and the depth of chloride impacts as identified on similar chloride concentration profiles. All areas of the remediation will have applicable guidelines, Tier 1 and or Tier 2. This will require confirmatory analysis. Subsoil salinity guidelines for the base of the subarea will be the Tier 2 SST derived guidelines for that subarea. Subsoil salinity guidelines for the walls of the subarea will be the adjacent or surrounding subarea guideline. It's important to remember that any topsoil stripping that has occurred is accounted for during this time. When there are co-contaminants and multiple areas of concern requiring remediation, guidelines for the base and the walls of the excavation can be quite complex. Must ensure that all impacts of concern have been remediated to the applicable guidelines. If further excavation is required at the base of a subarea, the walls of the deeper excavation should be to the applicable guidelines for that subarea, not the adjacent area, unless further excavation was completed along a wall of a subarea. Subsoil salinity guidelines for the base of a subarea are going to be the derived Tier 2 SST guidelines for that subarea. The photo on the left was taken during the excavation within subarea 1D, which is located right here in the dark blue box. There's a former tank farm area where impacts extended to 7 meters. Within this area, the base guideline for the subarea would be the derived guideline for subarea 1D. The walls of this deeper excavation would be the surrounding subarea 1A, as indicated with the yellow here, SST guidelines derived for that subarea. In the figure to the right, it shows east-west transect going across this excavation. That'll kind of put some further context on the subarea guidelines specifically for wall samples, which can oftentimes get confusing in the field. So subsoil salinity guidelines for the walls of subarea will be the adjacent or surrounding subarea guidelines. So for example, the subarea 1D that was completed to 7 meters, the walls of that excavation area would be the subarea 1A Tier 2 guidelines. Reminder that in the AER SST checklist, a cross-section is required with the confirmatory sampling concentrations and identification of any remaining exceedances. This is completed at the risk assessment stage of a project and allows for clear direction of wall and base guidelines for the remediation for the staff that's completing it in the field and directing the equipment. Confirmatory analysis will be required for all walls of the excavation to ensure they meet the applicable guidelines. And for the outside walls of the excavation, this would be to the background EC/SAR Tier 1 guidelines for the root zone and less than 100 milligrams per kilogram chloride. Initially, when evaluating a site, it is important to understand if there are areas that are co-contaminated with salt impacts, for example, metals and hydrocarbons, that exceed applicable guidelines, Tier 1 or Tier 2. If there are areas that require remediation for co-contamination impacts along with salt impacts, the spatial extents of the area need to be considered together. Additionally, the top and the bottom of the impact areas need to be considered for the co-contamination impacts. Remediation to all applicable guidelines will be required for each area. Also note that further excavation is required for newly identified impact areas from alternative contaminants. This can allow for more relaxed SST guidelines, as long as the further excavation is unrelated to subsoil salinity impacts. So in the photo to the left and also to the right, it kind of shows a subarea that was being excavated for a surface spill to the south of the site. The buried pit was identified while completing the remediation, containing hydrocarbon impacts, buried scrap pipes, and a concrete pad. Further excavation was completed for the identified hydrocarbon impacts, but an SST rerun was not required for this additional excavation for this newly identified impact area. Case study 2 had hydrocarbon and metal impacts within the Tier 1 salinity and acidity root zone impacted area. This would have effect on the spatial impact area, but also determine the top and bottom of the respective areas. Low-level Tier 1 root zone salinity impacts that are co-contaminated will be required to be landfilled. On the left, it indicates hydrocarbon impacts within the tank farm area to the north, as well as the overland spill area to the south. The middle indicates areas with Tier 1 metal exceedances that were observed, and to the right indicates that both areas, the hydrocarbon and metal impact areas, are within the Tier 1 root zone EC and SAR exceedance area, as highlighted by the red dashed line there. Soil that is co-contaminated will likely require landfill disposal. Important to clearly define subareas where this will apply to ensure that soil is efficiently stockpiled, not to be potentially reused in other subareas of the excavation. This is important when defining your stockpile placement and truck routing to minimize movement of stockpiles, allow for room for trucks and equipment to safely operate at the site. Communication with clients, landowners, and contractors is critical when completing SST remediation, as the site may require waste segregation, which includes additional stockpiles and larger work areas that might not be considered based on areas and volumes alone compared to standard remediation. On the figure to the right, for this case study area, the co-contaminated soil that was not to be reused was stockpiled to the right there in this red dashed line, and that was all to be landfilled. Low-level salinity impacted Tier 1 root zone soil from this area was stockpiled in this blue box here for potential reuse as backfill. Low-level salinity impacted soil without other co-contaminants exceeding applicable guidelines, Tier 1 or Tier 2, could potentially be reused as backfill in areas where the depth exceeds the rooting zone. Low-level salinity impacted soil can only be reused in areas where previous higher concentrations were present. This figure shows how clean imported backfill must be used within the rooting zone and subsoil, but there are possible of reusing low-level impacted root zone material in the base of the excavation below the rooting zone. Low-level salinity and subsidence impacted soils could be reused as backfill in areas where higher impacts were previously observed by location and depth, providing no Tier 1 exceedances for other parameters, for example, metals and hydrocarbons, are present. Very important that topsoil stripping is taken into account for the depth of the excavation. Also must understand the final surface contouring of site to ensure that reuse of low-level salinity impacted soils will remain below the rooting zone. It's important that when considering reuse of low-level salinity impacted soil, the transects through the excavation are surveyed prior to the stripping of the work area during excavation. In the photos here, it shows a sub-area excavation that was completed to 2 meters with half meter of low-level impacted soils to be placed in the base. Surveyed transects were taken across the excavation, and a dashed line was spray painted on the walls to allow for a visual marker for the equipment operators when backfilling this area. The tank farm area was where the deep chloride impacts up to 7 meters and were up to 5,000 milligrams per kilogram. Overlying soil from the 0 to 2.5 meters was reused as backfill within this area, where greater impacts were previously observed. Just a reminder that SST must be rerun with the top impacts to account for the reused low-level impacts for backfill. The figure on the left shows the depth of impacts and the guidelines derived for this deep remediation area. Also highlights the low-level salinity impacted soil that was to be placed at the base of the excavation. The figure on the right shows how Tier 1 EC and SAR impacted root zone soil from sub-area 1C, which is this light blue dashed area, was to be placed at the base of the excavation. Note in both cases, we are not excavating clean soils and placing impacts and putting low-level impacted soils into excavation area where depth was previously more contaminated and removed. The SST guideline derived for this sub-area was 1,500 milligrams per kilogram. It addresses most boreholes with the exception of one borehole representative of a hotspot. Rather than rerunning the SST guidelines to account for this one borehole guideline exceedance, one can dig down to that area to obtain confirmatory samples less than 1,500 milligrams per kilogram. There's no need to derive the guidelines in a sub-area if there is one hotspot that stands out from the majority of impact profiles. Note that confirmatory results will be required at the base of this additional excavation area, as well as the walls. With the reuse of impacted soils, there are some calculations that are required. Let's recalculate the guidelines within SST to see what depth interval the tank farm could be backfilled with impacted soil from shallow tank farm soils and from the surrounding low-lying, low-level salinity and acidity impacted root zone. As well, with SST version 3.0, have to also consider sodium and SAR guidelines as well for all this. Additional volume calculations. Side slope considerations, how much void space is available that covers the specific depth range, and compaction requirements, as well as mixing considerations of the backfill. We use the upper bound statistic, the 95th percentile max, and it's the easiest, less risk way and is more conservative for considerations of mixing backfill. You cannot mix clean unimpacted soil with impacted soil, and cannot mix heavily impacted soil with low-level impacted soil. And with the reuse of impacted soils, there's cost implications to consider as well. For this site, the total site volume sent to landfill was reduced by approximately 35%. For the $800,000 total remediation program cost, it saved approximately $220,000 in landfill backfilling and trucking cost. Cost increase can also result due to the larger workspace requirements, the landowner damages, and reimbursement of loss of crop. Materials and handling. It's critical that good stockpile material segregation and tracking is completed during the remediation to ensure that there's no co-contaminated impacted soils being reused, and efficient and safe use of workspace. The additional cost for this program was approximately $60,000 for those considerations. The net savings was approximately $160,000 or 20% of the total project cost. Percentage saved would vary considerably between sites and complexity, but pre-analysis and planning is the key to completing these. So with that, that's the end of the presentation. Be able to take a few questions if anybody has any, or I also have my email as well as Anthony's email just at the end here. And we'd be happy to take anything as well after the fact if anything else comes up.
Thanks, Jonathan. Does anyone have any questions for Jonathan? If so, please type them in the question or the chat and I'll get to them. Jonathan, is there, I believe I've seen there's training sessions on SST going on, or are they upcoming, or are they over?
Yeah, we've always got like a series of upcoming training sessions. They're completed online right now, and been hearing good reviews of them as far as that format goes. So check our website for upcoming dates.
Great. Okay, so if anyone has any questions for Jonathan, please, you can reach out to him directly. His information's on the screen, and again, all the presentations will be shared along with the video. So Jonathan, with that, thank you very much, and we'll move on to our next presentation.
Thank you, Joe. Everybody have a great day. Thanks.
Our next presenter is Dean McKenzie with the Vertex Resource Group. Dean, you should have the link to bring up your presentation. Dean's going to be talking about powering up simulation training and environmental consulting.
Thanks, Joe. Can you see my screen?
No. Let me just. Yes, we can.
Okay, right on. Okay, thanks again, Joe. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for attending my talk. Now, I'm very excited to share our new environmental training simulator used for multiple applications. Now, the one I want to talk to specifically is on training. Now, I'm going to start off with a quick video of our oil sands themed training environment, then get into the evolution of how we even decided to build a training platform through the popular gaming platform Roblox. From there, I'm going to demonstrate and display the two service areas we fully developed the training simulator 4, which is detailed site assessments and bird sweeps. Now, these two scopes of work require constant training new staff, given the seasonality of the work. So I hope you enjoy the presentation. Keep an open mind about the possibilities such a platform can have. Now, so I don't know about you, but whenever I see that clip, the first thing I think about is like, wow, that looks like fun and I want to play. And I just wanted to bring this up before we get into the other serious parts of the presentation. But without play, I can tell you we would never have created this environmental training simulator. It was a combination of helping my 10-year-old son code his own video game in Roblox and just playing real life simulation video games with my kids that really sparked the idea of creating a training simulator for our work here at Vertex. Watching them interact with each other, learn from the games they were playing, made me realize how play and learning really have a huge impact on how we as individuals retain knowledge, how we engage with each other, and even how we innovate. Now, over the years, I got accustomed to that, we just got to work and focus on serious things. And really, this can be counterproductive. After several hours of watching YouTube videos for coding Roblox, it was clear that this game has endless possibilities in regards to its usability and functionality. When my son created his personal game, Bear Moose, it's really a game about surviving bears and moose. I have to say it triggered a desire to find a better way to make our real world challenges with training less challenging through Roblox, which really has endless possibilities. Now, whether at home or work, I think there's a lot of value of play, and if we incorporate some play into our day-to-day work, keep in mind the scientific research supports these outcomes, we should be able to improve our productivity, creativity, teamwork, innovation, job performance, morale, reduce stress, and the list goes on and on. When I think about this, if play can allow me to be creative and add value to my company, I truly do believe if we provide play in all aspects of our work and training, we can really facilitate creativity and engagement for all our employees. So for the next few slides, I'm going to talk about some more serious stuff and then switch back to the more playful part of the presentation where we get a closer look into the simulator. So I work for Vertex Professional Services. It's a division that provides key turn service from everything between application and planning stages to site closure for a diverse set of clients and industries throughout North America. Now, out of the 650 employees, about half are within our professional services group, and we continue to seek growth opportunities. With growth aspirations come growing pains, and often this is finding the right people and getting them trained in a feasible and safe manner. When you look at the environmental consulting challenges across the board, we all share similar challenges. One, there's a shortage of skilled labor in our industry. Two, training new and existing staff can be challenging just due to the multiple factors such as costs, site access, having the right people available to train, and maximizing their knowledge retention so that they can go out and work safely and independently as required. And thirdly, a common theme for all industries, and especially true for the oil and gas industry, is finding ways to be just faster, better, and cheaper. So to overcome these challenges, I was fortunate to have an inspirational thought while playing real life simulation video games with my kids. I thought if we could develop a virtual training program that allowed us to say 80% of the activities we do in the field, we could start to hire a larger available pool of untrained people and make them competent faster, better, and cheaper than the standard methods we use. You know, virtual training is simply what it is. It's training done in a virtual or simulated environment. You know, participants experience real-world situations through virtual practice. Now, there are many types of delivery systems and platforms out there to help one train, and each one comes with its pros and cons. Some examples include virtual reality and augmented reality. We stayed away from both virtual reality and augmented reality just because we didn't understand it as well. And the limitations in developing a training simulator is cost and very specialized expertise and equipment needed for the development and especially the deployment of the simulator. So we stuck with a less immersive technology, which is the creation of a simulated environment. Now, one can train people through virtual classrooms or virtual environments. The advantage of a virtual environment is you can create similar experiences and collaborate virtually as in same thing as in the field. And it really does provide a more hands-on approach to learning and training versus just say listening to somebody talk, reading about it, or watching a slideshow. So getting back to virtual training, some big advantages is it saves time, reduces costs, it enhances safety. You know, it really removes that accessibility barrier, not just from the aspect of going out to a remote site to teach somebody about training certain aspects of a remote site, but just getting to the site itself with multiple offices throughout, a province or a country. It really improves employee performance and enhances engagement. So when we, were developing at the beginning stages of developing the simulator, our objectives were quite simple. One, create a real immersive experience. We want to drive value in our day-to-day operations, and also, develop an effective collaborative tool for employees, clients, colleagues, and partners. And a big thing is we want to make it fun. So now when it gets back to, choosing the right platform, we looked at multiple platforms and, we did decide we would stick with Roblox. One, it's free and popular. There's over 150 million users worldwide. It's a free, platform to build on and use. It's widely accessible, portable, no high-end equipment is required. You can do it on your iPhone or iPad. It's fun, it's safe, and it really does have endless possibilities. So, for example, this is me, Dean, and this is my team. Bob, he lives in Lloydminster. I'm going to train this team. Bill lives in Sherwood Park. Stu, he's the field lead in Fort McMurray. Sue, she lives in Victoria, BC. Rob lives in Toronto, Ontario. Ted, Winnipeg, Manitoba. Amy lives in Calgary. And Anna, this is a newly graduating student in Germany who's interested in joining Vertex, and she'll be training on our simulator through this platform. So looking at the game development, we want to focus on interactive e-learning, so it's expert-led training. These games that we designed weren't designed to just run through it independently and learn on its own. We really wanted that immersive experience like the field where you have a trainer and trainees. We want to focus on environments which we can build upon, so we started with the oil sands theme and then conventional oil and gas. When we developed the game, really it was developed in such a fashion to drive collaboration. And the big thing is reinforce key elements of the job. These are 70 to 80% of the things that we do in the field, and with a specific emphasis on safety. So I'm going to get into the first simulator that we developed. It's Bird Sweep. Again, it's oil sands mining theme. There's 10 bird species nests and calls. We tried to make the birds as real looking as you can in a cartoon fashion. The calls are real. They're real bird calls. There's a variety of habitats that you would find and conduct work in the oil sands region. It's instructor-led, but it does have some self-paced features, so people can work on it independently as well when they're used to the program. So some of the key elements of the job we want to reinforce. One is a big thing is mind driving. It's essential when we start working in the oil sands. Safety, all aspects of it, field preparation, bird identification. And the nice thing about doing this training virtually is that the data that you see in the simulator is the same data you would collect in the field. So while they're doing the simulator, they're actually entering that data, collecting it, and entering it into the app, so that when they actually go out to do some field training, the majority of these aspects have been taken care of, and then the trainer can focus more on some key aspects in the field and not have to do some of these other things because they've been taken care of already. Wildlife awareness is a big part working anywhere in the wilderness. So we've got bear spray, and other aspects of wildlife within the games. And teamwork. Teamwork's a big thing. So with this simulator, it definitely allows for that. So here's just an example of the Bird Suite simulator. So that kind of gives you a taste of what the Bird Sweep simulator looks like, a few aspects of it. Moving on to the detailed site assessment one, it's a conventional oil and gas theme. It's got cultivated and forest and land uses. There's 4 reclaimed well sites, 1 active well site. It's very much more instructor-led. Some, key elements of the job we really want to reinforce here was field preparation, driving and safety, a lot of the technical components that you would do in a DSA, especially finding the lease, picking proper controls, and just typical aspects of how you conduct a DSA. And again, similar to Bird Sweep, we've included all the data you would collect within a detailed site assessment so that people can learn how to incorporate that data into the app in the office as opposed to the field. And then these data that we use, the trainees would actually prepare a report. So when we actually evaluate the reports that they prepare, they're consistent in how we evaluate them from season to season, year to year. And again, some key elements was communication. This collaborative virtual environment really does help, promote communication amongst the trainers and trainees. So here's an example of the DSA simulator. Now, this video here just shows, a bunch of people doing some beta testing here, how they interact with the group as well. It's a shared experience. So, when you take when one individual takes a sample point, that sample point is used. You can share sample points, or people can just work around the instructor. And that instructor would just explain how this data is collected. From there, you would go out to the field and show them how to do it. Yeah, so for the most part, we've tested it with a university group internally and some other external people, and so far the results have all been positive, and people very much like it, and they're quite engaged. There are a few things that we are going to update, but right now, in the short amount of beta testing that we've done, it showed extremely promising results. So again, some of these outcomes, 100% of users found it extremely useful. It really does enhance collaboration, engagement, sparks a lot of creativity, and a big thing is it reinforces safety, logistical, and technical components of the job. Now, some of the feedback that we had, it's very cool. It's a team building machine. It's a lot of fun. Even kids do this. I know my kids, they know more about DSAs than I did after my first year of college, and they're 4, 8, and 10. And again, 80% of the field activities can be taught right here at your home. Of course, you're not going to teach how somebody to texture soil, but you can teach them, how to get to the site, what to look for before that. Now, some of the challenges, we had in developing the simulator, I think, as with anything you try and do, especially with this, coding and scripting within the confines of Roblox, you are kind of even though you have endless possibilities, there's a big learning curve, and how you code and script within Roblox when you're trying to fit your world into their world. A big thing with developing Roblox, the platform really banned a lot of technical words that we use, just because it is kid friendly. So killdeer, because it had the word kill, we couldn't use, so we had to change it to noisy plover. A1 is apparently used as a surrogate for cocaine. Weed, obviously, out of all these things, it didn't, there was multiple words that we just couldn't use. So we just had to find a workaround in terms of how we discuss those in the virtual world. And again, it's almost too much fun. So with future developments of this, we're going to continue to beta test. I think we're going to make it open here over Christmas, and then a survey is going to be provided, and users can provide, their feedback on a survey so we can enhance the experience. We really want to enhance the learning experience in the new year. We're looking at, just incorporating more aspects of the game where people can start to, look at soils, classify them a bit different, and so forth. And again, we're going to provide training opportunities with our Indigenous partners, students, universities, and clients to get a wider outreach in terms of how we enhance the simulator. So we are going to expand environmental scopes beyond DSAs and bird sweeps. We do kind of want to make it, in one world where you can do multiple things for each group, such as rare plants. Phase 2's, a big one is underground line and ground disturbance. So we feel that with ground disturbance, we can really enhance the safety just doing this virtually, more so than even some of the training we get in the programs that we take. Spill response, we can incorporate aspects of that. We want to look at other industries such as renewables, transportation, and pipelines. So here's just a few, cut scenes that I had with my kids. They thought it would be funny if I incorporated it into my talk. It just shows you, just beyond the serious aspects of training, you can do some pretty fun and interesting things within the platform, such as how to get unstuck. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending my presentation. If there are any questions, feel free to reach out to me, or if there's time, I can answer them here.
Thanks, Dean. That's a really cool use of the technology. That's awesome. And I like noisy plover instead of killdeer. That's just pretty cool. That's good. Anyone have any questions for Dean? Dean, what's your email address? Just
It's D McKenzie. I can put it in the chat here.
okay.
There you go.
D McKenzie at vertex.ca for anyone that might have questions for Dean. Dean, doesn't look like there's any questions. So thank you again. Good luck with the future development of this, and appreciate the support.
Right on. Thanks, Joe.
You're welcome. So our next presenters are Jillian Ruse and Matthew Nooner from Golder Associates. Jillian or Matthew, whose desktop are we sharing?
That's mine. I'll.
Okay. You should get a link on your screen. And they're going to be speaking to us today on the mitigation of orphan well leaking methane in a residential area. Did you get the link? Perfect.
Okay, good morning. Thank you everyone for attending. The Orphan Well Association found an old well leaking methane gas in a residential part of the town of Vermilion in eastern Alberta. We found that the concentrations of methane in the soil gas were quite high right around the well, but also adjacent to the nearest houses. So we installed a soil gas extraction system, operated it for a year and a half, and then that together with a successful downhole intervention completed by the OWA, the risk from this well to the community was greatly reduced. Here's a picture of the well site. I'll discuss gas migration in general and introduce the well location and its history, and then present the results from our investigation. And then Jillian will take over and present the mitigations, the gas extraction system, the downhole intervention, and talk about the next steps. So we've all heard about some of the issues with abandoned wells, orphan wells. These issues tend to be more pronounced for older wells. The abandonment methods weren't as robust, and just with time, there's more corrosion, and so these older wells tend to be more susceptible to leaks. A couple examples, in the town of Kalmar, Alberta, there was an old well leaking methane gas in a residential area, and for that site to be safely managed, the nearest houses had to be purchased and then demolished. And then tragically earlier this year, there was an explosion in Wheatley, Ontario. It destroyed 2 buildings, injured 20 people, sent 7 people to the hospital, and displaced about 100 people. Luckily, there were no fatalities, but clearly this can be a pretty serious issue. So this schematic shows the conceptual model for gas migration. Gas migrates up the well casing or annular space, and where there's a leak in the casing, it can escape into the adjacent bedrock or soil. So we can have free phase methane gas migrating laterally under lower permeability layers. It then continues to migrate up into the vadose zone, where again, it can migrate laterally, and the process of methane oxidation can be important. And then ultimately the gas emits from the ground surface in a pattern that's not necessarily the same as the subsurface pattern. So there can be impacts potentially to soil gas, particularly presenting potentially an explosive risk to adjacent buildings. The atmospheric air can be impacted if, for example, there's toxins like H2S or benzene in the gas. And of course, methane's a potent greenhouse gas. And there can also be impacts to the groundwater quality. So the well is called the 10 well number 1 well. It's located in Vermilion, which is east of Edmonton. And here's the timeline for the 10 well number 1 well. We'll show this slide several times throughout the presentation. So the well was drilled in 1936. Some of the casing was removed in 1942. The OWA found the leaking well in 2013, and then they attempted a downhole intervention to try to seal the well in 2014. The well was drilled on agricultural land, and then that land was then redeveloped as a residential subdivision. The well was drilled in 1935 and 1936 to a depth of 639 meters. A surface casing shown in blue was installed to 158 meters. An intermediate casing shown in brown and red was installed into 497 meters, and the well was open hole below that. The annular space was never fully cemented, and the well was never put on production. In 1942, as part of the oil and gas boom during World War II, the intermediate casing was partially removed and the wellbore was damaged. Then the OWA found this leaking well in 2013, and in 2014 they installed an intervention casing shown in green that was used to try to seal the well. So the well originally targeted the Manville group, the heavy oil reservoirs there. So the leaking gas could potentially have been coming from there, but there were also several shallower formations where gas could potentially have been coming from. So isotopes were used to help identify the actual gas source. Stable isotopes of carbon and hydrogen in the methane suggested that it was a bacterial gas source using traditional methods such as the shoal diagrams on the left side of the slide. But the isotopes of carbon in ethane and propane indicated that actually the gas is a low maturity thermal gas. And so then the isotopic fingerprint of the leaking gas was compared to the fingerprints from other wells drilled more recently in the region. And as the plot on the upper right shows, the fingerprint of the leaking gas matches closely to the upper to middle Colorado group. Here's some pictures from the site. The one in the middle and on the left were taken the day that the well was found by the OWA. The well was cut off below grade where the orange cone is. And the picture on the right shows the intervention casing, wellhead, and surface casing vent that the OWA installed when they tried to seal it in 2014. And here's some pictures from that attempt in 2014. It's a pretty large rig that's needed for this kind of operation, and not a whole lot of space. So literally set up in the backyard of the adjacent house. And unfortunately, it was not successful in stopping the leak, and so the gas continued to leak from the well. So the investigation carried on from 2013 through 2019. Methane concentrations were measured right at the ground surface in the very shallow soil using a handheld meter in a radial pattern around the well. And it's a pretty efficient method, so it was done monthly for 5 years. And kind of similar to what's been seen in some of the research of, for example, at well sites in British Columbia, when we looked at this 50 months worth of this shallow subsurface gas data, there was essentially no correlation with temperature, barometric pressure, precipitation, or even the season. So here's a cross section of the shallow subsurface. The sediments are low permeability tills, and then right around the well, there's some coarse fill. The water table is 4 meters below ground in the winter and 2 meters below ground in the summer. And the methane gas is migrating up around the well through the soil. And then in the vadose zone, it migrates laterally away from the well. So methane is also emitting from the ground surface, particularly close to the well. And then farther away from the well, the methane concentrations are lower due to dispersion and oxidation. There's also methane dissolved in the groundwater, and methane gas has been allowed to vent from the well, from the surface casing vent, to keep the pressures down. So we installed 8 multi-depth soil gas probes around the site, shown with the red circles. The well is the yellow star. And we leak tested each of the gas probes and purged them before sampling, and then measured gas concentrations in the field, and then also took some samples for laboratory analysis. And well, the methane concentrations were quite high, up to 100% by volume methane, about a meter away from the well. And then the soil gas a little bit farther from the well still had up to 71%, close to a garage, and 10% close to the nearest house. We also measured the efflux of methane emitting from the ground surface in several locations around the site using a flux chamber. And just for context, there's been some research at sites in British Columbia and Ontario on this topic, and using essentially the exact same method, they've found a range of efflux for methane up to about 200 micromoles per square meter per second. And we saw actually a very similar distribution at this well site, up to 186 micromole of methane per square meter per second emitting from the ground surface. So we took that methane efflux data and correlated it with the 50 months worth of methane measurements, concentration measurements at the surface, and developed a distribution of the efflux from the ground that allowed us to estimate that the total methane flowing through the soil and emitting into the atmosphere was about 5 to 10 cubic meters of methane per day. And that fell close to the upper range of studies at leaking well sites in Pennsylvania and the UK. And just to put it in a bit of context, that's a similar amount of methane as running a barbecue for 6 to 8 hours per day continuously, or emissions from about 12 to 22 cattle. In this case, the methane was mostly coming, emitting through the soil within about 2 meters of the well, but it also extended farther. The methane was dissolved in the groundwater as well. Monitoring well close to the 10 well number 1 well had methane concentration of 18 milligrams per liter, which is pretty close to the solubility limit. And not surprisingly, the isotopes indicated that dissolved gas was the same gas that was leaking from the well. So we did quite a bit of isotope work at the site, and not surprisingly, the isotopes confirmed that the source of the gas in the soil and in the groundwater is from the 10 well number 1 well. But we did learn that some of the gas has a signature of oxidation of methane that's coming from the well and forming CO2 that has a low radiocarbon amount. So that's shown in the lower left plot with the red oval. And so that told us that microbial oxidation in the soil, in that less than 10 meters of soil between the well and the nearest house, was an important process. I'll hand it over to Jillian if you're able to share now, Jillian.
Good morning, everyone. Matt, can you keep sharing on your side?
Yes, I will.
Okay, awesome. All right, so Matt took us through the investigation of the leaking well, where it was discovered that methane was present in soil gas around the wellhead and in closer proximity to the houses. And so we were under pretty strict instructions to get this resolved pretty quickly. So we implemented a gas extraction system in 2019. And we'll go to the next slide here. Oops, can we go back one? Thanks. So the objective of the gas extraction system was to extract the methane gas from the shallow subsurface around the well and prevent migration towards the nearby houses. And so what we constructed was a fairly conventional soil gas extraction system with vertical extraction risers. And so we put in 3 extraction wells and also extracted from a couple of riser pipes that were right in close to the wellhead, and also a 6th extraction point was the surface casing vent itself. The blower operated continuously and extracted the soil gas and then vented that to the atmosphere through a riser stack. And the photo here is of early days in the construction as we're laying out the piping. And you can see it's tucked in the corner of the playground area in close to the houses. And the layout is shown on the next slide. Here, where the yellow box there is the shed and the green circles are the extraction points, and the wellhead is the star. So we took up a small footprint of the green space in the playground area there for the system. So the system began operation in July 2019, and we go over to the next slide. It operated continuously for about 1.5 years and was pretty successful at reducing the footprint of the methane and the soil gas and keeping it tighter close into the wellhead and preventing migration towards the houses. Had about a 7-meter radius of influence, so not a huge radius of influence given the tight clay soils, but we also weren't looking for a larger one. This served our purposes. And based on the flow rates and the concentrations, the overall gas extraction rate was ranged between 5 and 19 cubic meters per day. So within the range of the gas efflux that we had measured from the surface. And we'll go through some of the results here on the next slide. So this slide shows the methane concentrations in soil gas in September 2019. So it's about 2 months after gas extraction began. And you can see that the concentrations are much reduced to what they were previously. We still have high concentrations at 100% methane, so elevated for sure, tight and close to the wellhead, but the concentrations at the outer probes are much lower. We can see a comparison to the previous results, our baseline results from earlier in the year on the next slide. So just to refresh memories, we had up to 71% out at a few meters away. And then that was reduced down to minimal concentrations during operation of the soil gas extraction system. And then in terms of the efflux on the next slide, we did another round of soil gas efflux measurements, repeated the same points as we had previously. And so this time the soil gas extraction system was operating. And the soil gas efflux measurements were much lower than they were before the soil gas extraction system began operating. And but we still had some soil gas efflux. You can see there at BP08, close into the wellhead, where we still have a higher measurement. And then taking our correlation, we estimated that the total methane flow rate through the soil was about 2 to 5 cubic meters a day when the soil gas extraction system was operating. So it's reduced it by about half, but still some methane was moving up to the ground closer into the wellhead. And we estimated it was only about within 2 meters of the wellhead during operation of the mitigation system. So this was all done on the shallow side. So it's looking at controlling the methane after it has escaped from the well and is moving out through the soil. Concurrent with that, OWA was also looking at other options to go sort of fix the well in a more permanent manner. And they did a downhole intervention in fall of 2020 to further look at the well. And so the objective of the well perforation and diversion program was to perforate the casing of the well to encourage the gas flow into the wellbore and then reduce the gas migration through the soil around the well. So basically creating a pathway where the gas could migrate more easily in the wellbore itself and then be controlled at surface as it was coming up through a casing, rather than having the gas migrate up through the soil and disperse over a wider footprint. So the plan was perforate up to 3 intervals at targeted points. The first interval was down at about 230 meters at the base of the intervention casing, which had been installed in 2014. And then the need for the second and third intervals was to be evaluated based on the results of the first. And the second was targeted and within a portion of the damaged intermediate casing. And then the third perforation was planned to be at the base of the surface casing at about 158 meters if it was needed. And on to the next slide. So before this program was implemented, there was extensive community consultation by OWA. And I mentioned that specifically for this program, but really throughout the entire OWA's entire work on this well, there's been a lot of community consultation, a lot of information shared with the community. So for this particular program, the 13 houses that were closest to the well were evacuated during the perforation period for about 2 hours. The nearby residential roads were closed down, and as was the playground area. You can see in the picture there, we had an incinerator present to manage high gas flow rates in the event that these were encountered. And then we were also doing continuous environmental monitoring of the ambient gas concentrations and the gas flow rates. So lots of health and safety measures in place given this type of operation in a residential area. So what did we find? This plot shows the flow rate, cubic meters per day over time on the x-axis. And then on the secondary y-axis, we have pressure in kilopascals. And the green kind of squiggly line through there is the gas flow rate, and the blue is the gas pressure. So if we go starting from the left-hand side of the plot, we start with the casing perforation September 22nd. And it took a while for the well to be swabbed out, but then you can see there's a spike of gas that comes in, and then it stabilizes just under 25 cubic meters per day, and was pretty stable. We did some swabbing operations and just tracked the gas flow rate, but a fairly stable flow rate of 20 to 25 cubic meters a day, and this was essentially pure methane as well. So this was more than we expected to measure in terms of flow rate and concentration. So we weren't prepared to deal with it. So the well was shut in at initially at the wellhead and then later at the vent meter. And the pressure was allowed to build up while we regrouped and developed a management strategy for how we were going to deal with these higher flow rates of methane. And the plan on the next slide was to construct a vent stack and vent the well to atmosphere. So the well was the well was temporarily shut in during construction of this stack, and we did air dispersion modeling to confirm that a 6-meter tall stack was sufficient to disperse the methane given the flow rates and the concentration. And then after the stack was constructed, we did a controlled well blowdown to transfer the gas flow from the well over to the stack and decrease the pressure on the wellhead. And environmental monitoring conducted throughout and no issues there. So the So the mitigation system was operating during this time and operated for about 4 months following the intervention program. And after that, we wanted to see what the concentrations would be in the soil gas if the mitigation system was not extracting the soil gas. And so a shutdown trial was completed where we turned off the soil gas extraction system and looked for the concentrations in the soil gas to stabilize. And they bounced around for a while, and I think we've got a plot of it next. We'll just switch over to that one. Let's go to the concentration over time plot. Yeah, so they bounced around for a while and then stabilized pretty low. So this plot shows the concentrations of methane over time, and it goes back from the start of the monitoring back in June 2019, and the system was constructed and the soil gas extraction started. And then we have the perforation and the venting, and then the shutdown of the soil gas extraction system there. And you can see overall that the concentrations are now much lower than they were prior to the soil gas extraction system being constructed. But both the concentrations have decreased following the shutdown and the perforation. And if we go back one slide, let's look at that in plan view. So these concentrations were September 2021. So this was about 7 months after we stopped soil gas extraction, and about almost a year after the well perforation was done. And so you can see the concentrations of methane in the soil gas are much lower than they were previously. We have 0.4% at the probe closest into the well, and then no methane detected anywhere else. So the methane now is all coming up through the well bore, and it is able to be controlled that way, and it's not migrating in an uncontrolled fashion up through the soil gas. And then back to our soil gas efflux measurements. So you'll recall before mitigation, we had about 5 to 10 cubic meters a day moving up through the soil gas. And then after we began gas extraction, we're down to about 2 to 5 moving through the soil. And then taking us over to May 2021, we did another series of soil gas efflux measurements. And this is after the well has been perforated and the soil gas extraction system is no longer operating, and we have negligible gas migration reporting to the soil surface, which is great news. And so on to 2022 and next steps for the long-term management of this well. Where do we go from here? The plan is to continue the venting the well to atmosphere and construct some long-term surface gas or surface mitigation system infrastructure. And what that's going to look like is a soil gas extraction system, which is present and able to be operated in the event of a contingency, but is not intended to be operated on a day-to-day basis. And it will have a smaller footprint and be quieter at the request of the residents. You can appreciate that a blower in a residential area is loud. And we'll continue to monitor the soil gas, groundwater, and ambient air quality to keep an eye on the well, keep an eye on the flow rate from the well as well. And then this is still a surface mitigation, and OWA continues to do further evaluation of their well abandonment options, as well as the methane capture options. So potentially in the future, we'll move from venting the well to atmosphere to a methane capture system and add that on. And this slide shows the smaller footprint. So the green dashed line is the system fence, the current system fence. And then the purple, it will be the new system fence, so a much smaller footprint. And then the long-term building there is the purple box. And so this smaller footprint will be in the corner of the green space, but looking basically like a small municipal building with a fence around the wellhead. And to wrap up our presentation, we'd like to acknowledge many people that have been working on this well with us. So the Orphan Well Association, industry-funded collaboration among the Alberta government, provincial regulators, and oil and gas producers. And the OWA project leads in this case were Dave Marks and Jerry May. The town of Vermilion has been really excellent to deal with and very helpful in managing the well site. There's been lots of other contractors on site who have supported the OWA in managing the 10 well number 1 well site. Dowell, Frontier, GChem, Chemistry Matters, just to name a few. And then lots of other Golder teammates have been involved. And so shout out to our colleagues there. And with that, we'll open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Matt and Jillian for that. If there's any questions for them, please put them in the questions and I'll relay them. Not seeing any questions for you guys at this point, so feel free to reach out to Matt and Jillian at your convenience if you do have follow-up questions. So thank you both for presenting, really appreciate it.
Thanks everyone. Reach out if you have questions, we're happy to chat.
So our next presenter was called away for a family emergency, so that presentation is recorded and I will share the link to it after the session with the link and to these presentations, so you can watch that later. So what we're going to do now is take we'll 20-minute break. We'll restart at 10:15, and I've lined up all of the other presenters, I believe, to start a little earlier. So we'll be a little ahead of schedule for everyone. So we'll start back at 10:15. Hey, Tom, it's Joe. We're just on our break. We're going to get started at 10:15.
Okay, sounds good. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I'm going to share your
Okay.
desktop. We'll get your presentation set up.
Yeah, let me see if I can find the button for that.
Here, no, I have to send you an invite. Just a second.
Okay.
Should pop up on your screen.
Showing screen. So
Yep.
can you see it okay?
It's presentation mode.
Yeah. Let me make sure it goes on the right screen. Oh,
Yeah,
geez.
at the top there, display settings. Top right there, swap presenter view. And it should be good. There. Let's go.
Perfect. All right.
Go.
I'll go on mute and start at 10:15.
Yeah, I'll introduce you at 10:15. So 10 more minutes.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Thanks for joining early.
You bet.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We'll get started here with our next set of presentations. Next up is Tom Halea. Hope I said that right, Tom, with Jacobs. Moving past the perceptions. Over to you, Tom.
All right, thanks, Joe, and thanks everybody for joining. Appreciate it. I have a talk today that is all about the topic of natural source zone depletion and a little bit of a different spin on the topic, sort of related to the perceptions of the relatively new technology, the uptake of the new technology, and just kind of some suggestions on how you might use it going forward if you are one of those people that have not yet taken it up. So I've got just a simple agenda here, kind of go through a little bit behind why I wrote this presentation and why it's important. Then dig into a little bit some poll results that we did. We did some polling of some practitioners and have some good results here on how NSCD is perceived in the state of the practice. Talk about some different ways in which we can dispel some of those perceptions, ways in which NSCD is significant, and then just a kind of quick brief on how it can be used in both the conceptual site model and as a remedial approach. And then we'll just wrap it up with some closing thoughts and some food for thought. So the reason for the talk is this. Uptake, from my perspective, being in the field for almost 30 years now, closely following technologies at the university levels, it's painfully slow. How the good science that comes out of university and research organizations commercialized then has certainly become faster, but it's painfully slow how long it takes us to get it into our practice. As a consultant myself, I've watched many technologies sit there and we're talking about it, but it's not being used for some reason. So I've got a bullet list here of various different reasons why I think these technologies, this new science, aren't being taken up because of inefficiency technology transfer to us. Certainly when you first hear about a technology or new science and then building it into your routine practice is an evolution. So I understand that takes some time, but still slow. There's also perceptions to deal with, barriers if a regulator or other stakeholders don't know about it or acknowledge it, there's certain reluctance to use it. There's always the need for more data. I want more evidence that this is real and happening, and I can trust it. So when I pull it into my routine practice, it's something I can rely on. I get that. Sometimes there's distrust of new science without direct hands-on. And I actually think that's where we are a lot with NSCD. People are trying to get their hands-on with the science, with the measurement techniques, trying to get it to know it themselves for real so that they can then take it and use it. There's always a bit of complacency, the theory or thought that what I have is good enough. I got what I'm doing is working great, which is a little bit short-sighted in my perspective. There's always ways that we can improve. And then the expense, the perception that this is an expensive thing. So for NSCD, what is the deal? I think it's a good case study to really study the rate of new technology uptake, because I actually think it's been fairly aggressive and well communicated from the research organizations, of which there's a bunch you can see in the bottom left corner, to practice through publication of guidance documents from ITRC, from CRC Care in Australia, CLARE in Europe, and then ASTM is also jumping on board, ASTM International. So it's out there in relatively large visibility organizations. And then you can see in the lower right corner here that the publication counts are going up quite a bit. So this really just tracks the number of publications as seen in Google Scholar with either the word NSVD or source zone natural attenuation. And so you can kind of see the publications going up, and, you know, it really started, you know, let's say early to mid 2000s. And here we are in 2020 and still talking about it. So yeah, still talking about it. And the fact of the matter is you know, I'm one of the, I guess, teachers in the ITRC internet-based training series, and specifically teaching the NSED portion. And so we've got a poll question in there that asks how many of you have either heard of or used NSED. And we've been giving this presentation for close to 3 years now, and it's regularly 2/3 of the class has not used it or even heard of it. So I would have expected over that amount of time that number to go down, that you know, to show some sign that, you know, what we're doing with the outreach is working. So with that, you know, I've got a hypothesis. You know, why is the uptake of NSED slow? And, you know, the hypothesis is a predisposition to consider natural processes as inadequate. We have kind of this scientific background that we all went through in school and learned various different things that actually have been revised or updated over the years. And so I think it's important to kind of call some of those out, and that's what we'll kind of hit in a bit here. So to kind of back the hypothesis, myself and a group of others noted here on this slide put a poll together just to get some data. You know, I wanted to make sure that, you know, these ideas, the hypothesis, et cetera, are sort of borne out in the data in the field. And so we put a poll together. It's actually still out there, and I've got a QR code at the end of the presentation that maybe you can try to scan with your phone and fill it out if you haven't yet already. I'd appreciate it if you do, because we're trying to get more data to help inform us on what's happening with NSED. So here's kind of a summary of the poll results so far. So had about 52 responses, which is kind of small. This poll went out to LinkedIn audiences and hundreds of people that, you know, collaboratively between all the authors, we were able to piece together. But the good news is it does represent a lot of years of experience and a lot of sites. So over 1,000 in both of those cases. So we definitely hit the experienced practitioners and tried to kind of hone in on just their experience in the past 5 years to get the more recent experience sort of makes sense for this new technology. So, you know, let's say out of the 1,000 sites, the polling showed us about 420 of them were, you know, NSED was being considered. So actually that wasn't terrible, a little less than half, but that was good, you know, for this particular group of people, which I think would be sort of inherently biased towards NSED just because that's kind of where we sent this out to. Maybe, you know, the word that triggers for people that are aware of it. It was also good to see that, you know, only 14 of the respondents had not measured it or estimated its rates. So that's good. Like these numbers are not big. I would certainly like to see everybody considering NSED, but let's just say 40%. It's okay. The disappointing thing is that, you know, if you go all the way to the bottom of the slide here, only 70 of the 1,000 sites have actually carried NSED through all the way to the life cycle end, so into a decision document approved by the stakeholders or regulators. So this kind of gives you a quantitative feel for where NSED is now, just based on this poll that we put out. It's out there, people are thinking about it, but there's a hang up in the process somewhere. And certainly a hang up in the education or the outreach process as well to get, you know, we want that number higher than 42%. So why isn't NSED considered on more sites? This is a bar chart that kind of shows the answers to one of the questions. And the taller bars here are related to regulatory pathways and passive approach. So the way to sort of paraphrase this is that NSED is considered too passive and less acceptable. They want something more. or just going back to one of those perceptions, about why people don't uptake new technology. The perception is that because there's no regulatory or stakeholder endorsement of this new science, that there would be some particular hang up in the process, and so they even avoid going there in the first place. So this was kind of an acknowledgement, I guess, of the do nothing, the regulatory pathways, etc. One other quick note, most of the respondents, close to 90%, were consultants. So this is definitely not a poll result representative of the actual regulators themselves. It's mostly a poll result related to the practitioners. So I think that's important because I have a sneaking suspicion that the poll result of a regulatory audience, let's say, would actually be a little bit different, and that is something we're pursuing as the next version of this poll. Another question here, similar kind of bar chart result format, for those sites where NSED is being considered, where are you at? And so what's good to see is there's a good number of respondents, 16 in this case, that had approved remedies with NSED and decision documents. So that's great. But if you're kind of going from right to left in these bars here, you can see there's certainly a lot more sites in the early stages or still collecting data. And so that's why my comment earlier, I think people are still trying to get a handle on this science, collect data to really convince themselves that this is real data, not just kind of accept, a publication, which is oftentimes very site specific, and get the data themselves. So that was a bit of a verification that, yeah, people are looking at it. It's great, but we're kind of in that, early stage of uptake, trying to increase their familiarity and hands-on with it so they can figure out what to do with it. So that's where we're at with NSED, kind of interesting and nice to have the poll to bit back up the hypothesis. But, for the next part of this presentation, really want to focus on, those misperceptions. The regulatory hurdles, that's for another day, kind of mentioned that. I think what we've got in our poll here is a poll of practitioners. And so if the practitioners have a perception of slow or inadequate sort of remediation rates or infamiliarity, let's tackle that today. The regulatory uptake piece, that's for another poll, and we'll figure that out for the next talk. So let's kind of, for those of you in the audience that have not heard of NSED before or used it yet, let's hit some of the main points here in hopes of maybe convincing you to take a look at it for your projects. The first is just the misperception that NSED is insignificant. If you're going off typical understanding of, say, M&A, you are accustomed to rates that are small. And, typically remediation or mechanical remediation is needed to help stabilize some of these source zones and these plumes. But what we found is through measurements of gases, the biogases that are coming off of the biodegradation of these NAPL source zones, is that we actually have missed by orders of magnitude how much biodegradation was occurring. So that's kind of a key takeaway here. Again, for those of you that haven't heard of NSED, the methods that we have used historically to estimate natural processes are underestimating the rates by a couple orders of magnitude. And so it's important to take a look at those biogases and measure the CO2 efflux or the heat. Take a look at some of those guidance documents in ITRC, CRC CARE, and look at the specific methods and apply those at your sites and see what you get. You're going to find something like this. So we actually put a bit of a database together, and that's what these box plots show, is a comparison of NSED rates in green on the left-hand side, the rates of remediation in the units, common unit of liter per hectare per year here on the y-axis. To kind of get a good quantitative, again, trying to get quantitative with everything here, how NSED compares to these other systems. So we kind of glommed them all together, but then kind of broke them out into skimming systems, air sparge SVE systems, and then multi-phase extraction systems. And the results are shown here. The middle two quartiles are shown in the blown up boxes here in the middle. So you can see just with the dashed line going straight across here that NSCD rates on average around 7,000 liters per hectare per year, roughly 700 gallons per acre per year, fall in the range of those other types of systems, certainly better than on average than skimming systems, in the middle of the range for air sparge systems. And then multi-phase extractions for those systems sometimes do actually perform better. So a limited database, I wouldn't take away necessarily that MPE outperforms these other types of systems in general. It's just the sites and the data that I had for my sites. But I would take away that, you know, there is a break point in these systems. So initially, the rates of remediation are looking good. You're lots of NAPL in the ground, you're removing lots of mass, but there's pretty quick amount of time, a year to two maybe, where you deplete that hydrocarbon, the recoverable stuff anyway, and you're left with rates that are much lower than NSCD. So that's kind of the key takeaway here. If you're going to implement a system, use NSCD as a benchmark for operation. And that's kind of what this next slide shows a little bit. You can implement NSCD by itself, certainly, but for those sites with systems or some sort of risk profile that requires, or regulation that requires active or mechanical remediation, take a look at the time frame. And so here's a breakdown of the skimming systems and the aeration systems, kind of showing how early stage removal rates are better than NSCD. But the early, we just use 1 year for the time frame for these systems. After a year of time of operations, you see a drop off in these remediation rates, which kind of makes sense. You know, it kind of jives with the depletion of the hydrocarbon in the vicinity of your recovery wells, for example. And then the rates of NSCD start looking better. So again, use NSCD as a quantitative metric to help optimize and operate your systems for whatever amount of time makes the most sense. The key thing here is that NSCD is chugging along at essentially a constant rate over these, say, decade of remediation that we're doing. So that's the unique thing of NSCD. It's, assuming the subsurface conditions are relatively uniform through that period of time, you do get a constant rate of remediation, unlike these other systems that go up and down and things like that. So there's some real benefits there. And that's really what this next slide shows. You know, on the upper right corner here, we have our conceptualization of natural source zone depletion, you know, where you have your NAPL body, the biogases, as I mentioned, are coming up from the top, moving through the vadose zone, either through diffusion or advection, and where, you know, it collides, the methane collides with the oxygen coming down, you get conversion to CO2. And so even at ground surface, you can measure the CO2 efflux over this NAPL footprint and use that data to estimate your biodegradation rates. So that's the key, and tons of details in either CRC CARE document, which I think is probably the most recent, or ITRC, and then ASTM's coming out again soon. So you can reference any of those sources for more specifics on how to do these measurements. As I mentioned, the science is kind of updating based on what we might have learned in school, if you went to school a while ago like I did. We used to think that the oil has to dissolve into the water, and that's where biodegradation occurs. But what we're knowing now is that the bugs actually grow right on the oil. And so this electron microscopy photo is pretty cool. You can see the oil droplet right inside the cell wall of the Pseudomonas bacteria. So real nice evidence that it doesn't require this mass transfer to occur. It actually, these bugs are growing right on the oil, and then that explains how we get this biogas and the magnitude of biogas coming off the top of these things. So take a close look at the new science. It justifies these rates. So the second sort of uptake issue is just familiarity. So we've got the science part of it, but then how do I use it? Like, great, okay, there's this new science. Bio is bigger than we used to think, but how do I weave that into my practice? So that's really what this next section of the presentation is about, like applying that theory and those measurements and using those numbers into your site management. And so that is what requires some creativity and discussion with your coworkers and regulators and site owners to kind of figure out how this works for us, because these regulatory frameworks vary all over the place and site conditions vary all over the place. So I get it. It takes a bit of site-specific customization, I guess you could say, to get this stuff onto your sites. So here's some ideas on how you might do that for your sites. The first is to think about your NAPL body as a glacier. So if you have concerns of migration, or oftentimes it's mischaracterized as mobility. Really what we're most concerned about is making sure that NAPL does not move down the hillside, in this case, into areas of clean soil, let's say. So it is helpful to think of the LNAPL body as a glacier. You have evaporation and melting occurring, which is analogous to NSCD rates, or your NSCD processes, I should say. So NSCD is acting on the NAPL body as it sits in the formation. So initially, and say during colder climate times, let's say that the release was occurring or ongoing, and this glacier or the NAPL body was growing and expanding and moving down the hillside. But then, say the climate changes, starts warming, and the release is stopped, and then you get these processes starting to get cranked up and exceed the rates of release, or the head, let's say, of the ice or the oil on the NAPL body itself. And when that happens, those NSCD rates actually pretty quickly, within a year or two of the release stopping, can actually start growing to the point, and bugs acclimate, et cetera, and actually start pulling this NAPL body back. And so that's what you're seeing here at the very far right-hand side, sort of the terminal moraine here at the edge of the glacier is the same as the NAPL body. So let's just say hypothetically, if you were to install a well into this terminal area where the glacier was, or where your NAPL body was, you'll see stained soils, but you won't get NAPL into your monitoring wells. It just shows that the NSCD processes have reduced the saturation to the point where it's residual and just benign, essentially stained soils at this point. So that's a way to look at it. You measure the rates, you look at how large those are, you pair that up with your soil boring data and your monitoring well data with the in-well thicknesses even, and take a close look at where that NAPL body was historically, where it is now, and see if that explains, if NSCD explains how much of a recession you got. So kind of helpful like that. The next thing is, so that's just kind of on the CSM side of things. And in terms of how to use it as a remedy, as the poll showed, there's actually quite a few sites where NSCD has been approved. So take a look around, ask your peers who have had success with NSCD if you want to get some sort of direct information. But then, we gave some ideas here in the bullet list in the bottom left corner here about some of the sites that would actually be more amenable to an NSCD. So natural source zone depletion is significant. The fact is mechanical systems can't get it all out of the ground, but we're kind of stuck with this, where NSCD, perhaps is going to require an additional decade for remediation. So you've got to kind of work the site conditions, mitigate risks, possibly use barriers to exposures or something like that, institutional controls, et cetera, to restrict exposures. But if you can do that, then these 10+ year remedial timeframes, which are actually real for both mechanical plans as well as NSCD plans, become more doable. As long as you can protect human health and the environment, the remedy works. So you got to have the right risk profile. For sites with mechanical systems, those are all falling short, hitting mass removal plateaus. NSCD is a great transition technology. And then look at those institutional controls and things to help work this into your sites. So that's what I've got. Just a few closing thoughts. I do think there's room for improvement in our practice to just take a look at new science and talk with your peers, and try to weave it into your projects where you can. I just, I was recently on a phone call, and the subject of laser-induced fluorescence came up. And now that's a technology that's about 20 years old. And it was new to a couple people on the call. And it was just like, it's just such a typical thing. Like we need to be considering all of those different technologies out there, and SCD is one of those. I hope it's not 20 years before we start using this at more of our sites. Talk to your regulators or stakeholders. Take a look at the science and the documents out there and do some measurements. They're not expensive, and see how it might change your opinion or change your practice going forward. Because I think at the end of the day, with the conversation really getting cranked up about sustainable and resilient remediation, really sustainable and resilient everything to help with the climate change, then we need to be looking at NSED, because it is one of those technologies that'll be helpful to us to stop burning so much fossil fuel. So just a little bit of food for thought here. Take another look at your sites, and even just using literature values here on the right-hand side of this slide. Put your remediation systems in this common unit, so you kind of have to normalize it per unit area, hectare, acre, whatever you use, and see how it's doing. At most of our sites, we're getting about 7,000 liters per hectare per year. So just use that number. And if you see that NSED is actually doing quite a bit more, then boy, that changes fundamentally your understanding, where maybe you do have some nice reductions in groundwater concentrations, etc. I'm guessing a lot of that was done by natural source one depletion and not necessarily by your mechanical system. So here's a bibliography for people who do end up downloading the file, which is, you're all more than welcome to do that. And then I'm going to leave it here with the QR code. So the poll is still open. If you click on this, it will take you right to the website. It's just a Microsoft website form. It's completely confidential, unless you want a copy of the results, in which case you can drop your email address in there in the last question, and then we'll send you a copy of the results, probably in a month or so from now as we get updates. So I will leave it there. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it. And back over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Tom. If there's any questions for Tom, please put them in the question box as always. Tom, does that QR code get them your contact info as well, or?
No.
Okay.
Let's see. Yeah, I can provide that separately.
Yeah, can you just type it in the chat, and then people have it if they need it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Or people can contact me directly, and I'll forward it on to them. I have it, so.
I got you right here. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Any questions for Tom? Looks like we. Okay, Tom, doesn't look like there's any questions for you at this time, so.
Okay.
Hopefully get some more responses for your poll from this group, and that'll help you out.
Great.
So that'd be great. So with that, we'll move on to our next talk. Our next talk is from Neil Barretto and Jake Gronfeld from Associated Environmental Consultants. Gentlemen, which one of you is sharing sharing the presentation?
Hey, good morning, Joe. I'll be sharing it. Neil here on the line.
Neil?
Yeah.
Okay. Hopefully I got the right Neil. I think you're both logged in as Neil, so just a second.
Okay.
Something should jump up on your screen that says, did you share your desktop? Did you get it?
No, I have not gotten it.
Just give me a second. How about now?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay. So they're going to be speaking to us about a project they worked on in Hong Kong at Pillar Point Valley Restoration. reducing leachate production via groundwater management. And if I'm not mistaken, Neil, this is a former landfill, right?
Yes, that's correct. And I just wanted to confirm if you can see the presentation.
My computer's acting up. Give me 1 second. Yeah, if you go to the top there and go to display settings on the left, top left. Top left of the screen.
Oh,
Display
yeah.
settings. Yeah, go swap presentation view and then it'll be in full screen. There you go.
Oh, perfect.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you, everyone online for attending our presentation that we put together. As Joe said, my name is Neil Barretto. I'm a junior hydrogeologist working out of the Calgary office for Associated Environmental. And I had the amazing opportunity to work with Jacques Ronwald, who is the senior hydrogeologist on the project. And today I'll be presenting the methodology and results of reducing leachate production through groundwater management at the Pillar Point Valley landfill in Hong Kong. The presentation we put together, it'll highlight the study area, the challenges the client faced during the time of closure, the background information that we had to review upon, before doing any intrusive field work, reviewing historic data. And then after that, we had to create a scope of work that would help minimize the leachate generation at the site. We put together a monitoring plan to monitor the system after we had installed everything. And then at the end, we will talk about some challenges and takeaways that we learned throughout the process. So what you see on the left is a satellite image of the site outlined in red, which is what we call Pillar Point Valley landfill. The landfill is positioned in a valley along the western flank of Castle Peak. And I'm not sure if you can see my mouse pointer, but Castle Peak, the highest point in the area, is just this top right corner here. And it's what you can also see is large faults, and we've highlighted that in the orange dotted lines. And you can see that on the satellite image, and you can also see that on the right, which is a snapshot of a geology map of the area. And a quick history lesson, the landfill started its operation in 1983 and was closed in 1996. After filling the landfill cells to capacity, the landfill was capped. They planted vegetation on top, and a surface drainage system, which we'll be discussing, was constructed. However, despite these measures, leachate generation continued to overwhelm the treatment system that they had at the site. The figure on the left is a hydrological model highlighting the different mechanisms and flow paths in which rainfall, runoff along the sides, and groundwater influence the generation of leachate. So the first concern post-closure that the client had was the landfill cap, and you can see that highlighted in green. The cap was getting old, it started to crack, and because of increased rainwater, it would infiltrate and then subsequently cause an increase in leachate by just going into that waste section you see in the middle. So the cap was subsequently repaired, and it's currently in good condition. But then a second issue arose, and that was the rainwater falling on the sides of the landfill, and it would make its way down along the sides and infiltrate the fractured network around the site. Now, the solution to this was to create a concrete channel, and the photo of what you see on the right, that is a photo of the concrete channel that they created, was to divert the rainfall so that it could make its way downwards to a collection area. However, this didn't work as planned, and what they found was that you have a fractured network all around the landfill site. So as the rainfall was coming down, it would go into this network and then make its way all the way down into the fill area, which is what you see at the bottom. So when you have all this water going into the fill area, you have to treat more water, and it became even more evident after the liner in between the waste mass and the fill area started to degrade. So you have the waste mass on the top and then this liner in between. And what they found is that as the liner degraded and got worse, the leachate would percolate downwards and go into the fill area, which means that they would need to treat more of the leachate coming out of the system. Just a quick overview again. So some of the challenges, the breach cap, as we said, the leachate percolating down from the waste mass. They had to treat two major contaminants of concern, one being ammonia and to a lesser extent chloride. In order to treat these, they used thermal heat stripping. And the process of that is high cost of diesel, and it also produces a lot of air contamination, air pollution. In saying that, they also didn't anticipate how much they would need to treat, and the system that they had there just didn't have the capacity to treat the leachate after large rainfall events. A couple photos. The one on the left is the main landfill area, so they planted vegetation on top. Everything below that would be the waste mass. And on the right, what you see is a photo of the treatment containment where they do the thermal heat stripping to treat the leachate. Associated scope of work after kind of understanding the background, we did a desktop study and did a field visit. The second phase was a couple of geophysical surveys. The third was a drilling program, which involved installing pumps and doing pump testing, completing a final well design and pump installation. And then phase 4 was a monitoring system so we can monitor groundwater levels over time. We'll just start with phase 1. The first part was the desktop study. So Jacques and Norm, they looked at a 2005 study that was completed by another consultant. And this provided the first opportunity to evaluate how the natural surface and groundwater flows occurred within the Pillar Point catchment area and how the flows just interacted with the landfill mass itself. So the data they reviewed was historic rainfall, monitoring water levels, and there weren't too many of them. I think the client was only measuring water levels once per month at that time, so we didn't have a lot to deal with. Groundwater pumping data, weak and strong leachate flow data, groundwater chemistry, and borehole logs, which were provided to us. So after reviewing all that information along with the 2005 study, the consensus was that, yes, there is a breach in the liner, and it is causing an increase in leachate production, but also that the groundwater inflow into the base of the landfill is making it worse. During the field visit, the team, they saw that there were a couple of monitoring wells already installed. So that's what you see here. On the left is the initial monitoring wells, and on the right, there are a couple more monitoring wells that were just measuring the groundwater throughout time. So the key part, the graph that you have here in orange is the weak leachate generation from 2006 to 2017, and that's compared to the rainfall data from that same period. What you see here is after a rainfall event, there's usually an average of a 6-day lag between rainfall and then an increase in weak leachate collection. The graph also highlights the fact that the groundwater recharge via rainfall is the driving factor of this generation of weak leachate, making it important to capture any groundwater before it has time to mix with the leachate that's percolating from the landfill mass from above. So at that first model that I showed, you have the leachate percolating from that waste mass, but then you also have rainfall coming in from the sides. And the idea of our project was mainly to capture the clean groundwater before it even has time to enter into that fill area. Furthermore, this graph, it has the weak leachate, but it also has a strong leachate, which is seen in dark blue. And there's 2 things I want to highlight. The first being, as I said before, the weak leachate volume is directly influenced by rainfall and exhibits a very quick response to any sort of rainfall event. The second observation is how the strong leachate actually doesn't respond to rainfall events in the same fashion as the weak. In fact, the magnitude of the strong leachate volume is much slower, and the volume generated is also lower. The third and final observation is that the weak leachate in the dry season between, if you look at the winter spring of 2010, remains low all the way to 2016. And the reason for that is because at that time, in that period of time between 2010 and 2016, there was a groundwater pumping well that was, that had an impact in reducing the weak leachate during that time. And that's evident in this graph right here. So the green line is the pumping, the groundwater well pumping data. So we can see there is an observable relationship between up gradient pumping and the measured down gradient weak and strong leachate volumes. We realize while a possible relationship is observed in this scenario, a similar pattern is not observed for the strong leachate flow due to the fact that the weak leachate formation is controlled by groundwater inflow versus the strong leachate is more related to the dewatering of the waste mass. The team also reviewed water quality data, which is provided by the client from 2006 to 2017. The team compiled trilinear diagrams, but also these stiff diagrams. The stiff diagrams for the wells located within the landfill mass are seen at the bottom 5. So that's QWM5, the bottom 5 that you see on the screen. And those have high residence time of nitrate, alkalinity, and chloride components versus the groundwater wells that are not in the landfill, but in the surrounding bedrock, and that's the top 2 rows. And it's clear that there's a little interaction with the bedrock as they represent freshly recharged groundwater. And this is an important finding because it suggests that the rainfall charges the fractured bedrock aquifers, which results in the need to reduce the groundwater levels by pumping. Quick summary, we reviewed the 2005 hydrogeological study. The assumptions and conclusions in that study remain valid. We learned the rainfall definitely has a large impact on the leachate generation, to a greater extent weak, but also the strong. Upgradient pumping is extremely effective in reducing that, and upgradient pumping also reduces the weak leachate specifically. Phase 2 was the intrusive work, which we used 3 geophysical methods: magnetic, electromagnetic, and resistivity. After reviewing the historic and existing data, the team proposed these methods, and it was used to delineate the geological structures at the site and to establish the most effective drilling locations so we could maximize and capture the most amount of groundwater in the fracture zones at the site. What you see on the left is a satellite image of the project area. We just used Google Earth and we drew lines for the electromagnetic and magnetic lines, and that's what you see on the left. And on the right image are the ERT lines. A cool part about the project was due to the lush vegetation and just the terrain that we needed to get through, the client actually contracted out the Hong Kong Climbing Club to come in to harness themselves up and then climb and remove a lot of the vegetation at the site. And along the way, they would mark with spray paint every 5 meters. They would mark it with spray paint, and then every 50 meters, they would put a flag in to just show that it's a geophysical station. So the 3 methods that we used, we had magnetic. The associated team of Jacques and Norm, they completed the magnetic and electromagnetic survey. So the first photo, that's Norm with the portable magnetometer. The second photo, that's just a stock image, but that's the methodology we used was a 2-person portable EM34 with a 40-meter coil separation. And then after the MEG and EM data was collected, a geophysical consulting company from South Africa joined our team, and they completed the resistivity survey on sections where anomalies were evident based on the EM and magnetic data. So I'm not going to divulge too much into the geophysics, but this is what the data looks like that was output. So I just picked a line, so that's line C that cuts right across the landfill. And what you have on the graphs is the red line is a vertical dipole, the blue line is the horizontal, and the black line is the total field magnetics. And below that is the ERT data. So just to give you an idea, like target 1 was picked out as a drilling location because it's positioned on a low resistivity area that corresponds to the side of a dipole magnetic body and a higher horizontal dipole EM anomaly. If you want to talk more about the geophysics, I'm sure Jacques can answer some questions at the end of the presentation, but that's just a quick overview. Based on all the data, and the lines surveyed on the left, we were able to pick drilling locations. And so what you see on the right are all the drilling locations that we proposed to the client, which led us into phase 3. And it's where we got to have like the most fun, because we got to drill. And we started with an exploration drilling program. Our team was over there. We supervised the drilling and logged the lithology. We drilled 18 exploration wells between January and November of 2018. And to save costs, we actually deepened 2 other wells that were already existing at the site. Just a couple photos of the drilling process. With the first 8 meters, we went with casing. So we had a 20-centimeter steel casing that was advanced to 8 meters, and then after that, it was all open hole. And it was quite unique because there were certain spots that were tough to get to. So the first photo on the left, that photo is of a drill rig on a bamboo platform. So the client had to actually engineer this platform, and they took a crane and then we moved the rig on top. And there was another part where we built a bamboo bridge to get from one side of the valley across to the other side of the valley. So quite unique scenarios, but quite successful at the end of the day. Here are a couple photos of the drill cuttings. The lithology, predominantly granite, and what we were looking for were larger breakout pieces, which you can see at the bottom. An increase in oxidized cuttings. We would also take a look, the hardness of the rock, and also, and the most important one is any distinct water strikes that we were encountering during the borehole cleaning process. So at times we would ask the driller to fill the hole with water just to clean out the fractures, but there were times where we would just let the drill rig sit, let the water accumulate in the hole, and then blow it out with air just to see what type of yield we were getting. After the drilling program was completed, we got a cool piece of technology, and what you see on the bottom right photo is our well camera. I actually get the chance to use that piece of equipment quite frequently. We have it in our Calgary office, and the cool piece about it, about the well camera, is that you have a downhole view. So that's what you see on the top left-hand picture there, 36 meters. You're looking straight down into the hole. But then you also can switch to a side view and look at the side of your borehole, and that's where you can really see any sort of large fractures. And that photo would be the bottom left photo where it says 7.36 meters. So we camera surveyed quite a few of the wells just to confirm what we saw in the drilling program, and then we went on to test the wells, which came with its own challenges. We had to source a lot of the material locally in Hong Kong. So as you can see, these are some of the struggles that we had. Cable tying up on itself, and we didn't have anything motorized, and you're putting a pump down 145, 150 meters manually. It's quite tough on the equipment, and on us who were installing them. But we learned from that. We had this piece of equipment brought over from South Africa. Jacques built it in South Africa, and we had it shipped over. The client was nice enough to put a motor on it, and then it made our days easier. We just, with a switch of a button, we can lower and raise the pump for all our aquifer tests. Some of the tests that we did, they ranged from 2 to 72 hours. And based on the data, we were able to finalize the pump sizes for the permanent installations. We found that the testing yielded 10 to 12 liters per second for a majority of the holes. The pumps were sized to maximize long-term pumping. We didn't want any sort of cavitation to happen over time, especially during the dry season. And the pumps were positioned at an average depth of 140 meters in order to maximize the dewatering potential of each hole. Some more, I guess, the majority of the materials that we sourced were from North America, so we had everything shipped over, and then when we arrived, we were able to help the client and their team put everything together and then install the permanent installation. One other side note is that photo on the right, that's myself there, and then Jacques on the bottom left. One thing we noticed, a challenge we had, was when we were doing the testing, since these are all open holes, we would get equipment stuck or get caught in or tear and get damaged just by installing them and then removing them. So a solution to that was actually installing HDPE screens. So on a couple of wells, we were able to source this material, the client was, and then we install them, which makes their life easier in the long term, because when it comes to maintenance and operations, you can remove it easy without damaging anything or getting anything stuck, because it is a lot of money if you lose a well because you have a pump stuck inside. A couple more photos of the installation. We built another reel to install the HDPE pipe. Everything was fitted with a pitless adapter. And after installing everything on the wells that we drilled, we were able to look at the data, and the average volume of groundwater being pumped from the wells at the landfill increased from approximately 4,000 cubic meters per month to about 10,000 cubic meters per month later on after we completed everything. So the primary goal was to extract groundwater from the up-gradient fracture system before it could even enter the waste mass. And I feel like that's what we did. But we also understood that the relationship between the up-gradient slopes, the fracture system, and the waste mass is quite complex, and it would be impossible to intersect all the groundwater entering the landfill. But even so, the removal of water from these fractures can still reduce the overall volume of weak leachate being collected down gradient of the site. And to show that visually, data-wise, this graph explains it quite well. What you have in orange is the weak leachate collection, and then you have the combined groundwater dewatering in the dotted blue, and then the rainfall data in the solid blue. So after the drilling phase was completed, the pumps were installed, we were able to look at all the data. What you see in 2018, that first large spike was due to a typhoon that hit Hong Kong, which brought in heavy rainfall. But we can see that after that spike, over time, the weak leachate starts to decline. And one thing that's really cool to see is that June 2020 is a particular interest because we see the rainfall amount is similar to 2019. However, the weak leachate has been reduced by 10,000 cubic meters, for that month at that time. So we definitely know that the system is having an effect on reducing the weak leachate. Before we left, this is the system. All the discharge lines were, as you see in the center there, and we would just measure everything with a bucket and a stopwatch. And the client was able to improve the system by having everything nicely laid out. And then they had inline flow meters that were installed so that it would be easy to keep a track of how the wells were performing. And phase 4, the last phase, is ongoing. We're monitoring groundwater levels, the discharge volumes, and we're receiving water quality from the client. They're collecting that. Now, all the data, the water levels, discharge volumes, and water quality play a large part in being able to discharge the water that is getting pumped out by the system. And so they need to show that to the Hong Kong Environmental Department, and only then can they release and discharge this water into the ocean. And before we left the site, we installed a telemetry satellite system to monitor groundwater levels in some of the select groundwater wells. Last but not least, just some challenges and takeaways. Some of the challenges was just the language barrier. As I said before, we had limited groundwater levels. They were only measuring once a month, and after the first field visit in phase 1, we suggested that they install water loggers so that they could have daily records of the groundwater levels. Site conditions, as I said, the vegetation and just the terrain was difficult to deal with, especially on the drilling program side. There were a few consultants and contractors that had the experience in managing a project like this to this scale, especially from the other side of the planet. And when we were at site, not only were we consultants, but we also worked as contractors. It was our team that was helping pulling pumps out of wells, designing them, putting them together. So we used more than just our brains, but also some brawn. And finally, just the last bit of takeaways is the cost savings and the environmental impact is being reduced, right? Like they don't need to burn as much diesel. They don't have to buy as much diesel. They don't, if the system's getting overwhelmed, normally they would bring trucks in, drive it to a different landfill site, and then get it treated there. And that's all been done and away with. So long term, they save a ton on the costs, and then also they're just, the air pollution is significantly reduced, and they're doing their part on that site to make a difference. And last but not least, this project was spearheaded by Norm DePerno. He worked in the Calgary office up until 2019, and the team that worked on this project was very small. And Norm was instrumental in getting us the work and also coming up with the ideas. So thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask Jacques or myself.
Thanks for that, Neil. If there's any questions for Neil or Jacques, that would be great. If you as well could put your contact, your email address in the chat, that would be great for people and they can check it there.
For sure.
Yep. And as a reminder, the presentations will be available and sent out after along with the video link. So I don't see any questions for you, Neil. So if anyone has any questions, you can reach out to Neil and Jacques. Their contact information is in the chat. With that, doesn't look like our next presenters are here yet, so I might switch the order. Joanne, are you available to start?
I need just a couple of minutes to open things up.
Okay, yeah. I can send you a link to share and
Okay.
we'll, if you don't mind going early, that'd be great.
That's fine. If the others show up before I respond, you can start them too. So,
Okay.
okay.
I'm just sending you the link. Okay, Joanne, the others showed up, so sorry about that. We're going to go to the others first. Is that okay?
No problem. Yep, that's fine.
Is Wayne, are you there, or is it Wayne and David?
You got Wayne here. David is logging on shortly.
Okay. Yeah.
David has the presentation.
Now, if you can hear me.
Okay, you're both logged into the same person. Okay. I'm going to send you the link to log in or to bring up your presentation. Hopefully I picked the right one. Did one of you get the link?
Yeah, I got it. David needs to get it.
Okay, just a second. Try this one. Did you get it, David?
Yeah, hang on.
Okay. So our next presentation is David Milkey and Wayne Harris from Milestone Environmental out in BC. They're going to speak to us about the complexities and solutions of Canada's industrial brownfields. So just on the top left of your screen there, just click the display settings and then swap the view. Top left, nope. Top left of the, it says show taskbar, display settings, and slideshow.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
You click display settings. Nope.
Sorry. Which one?
Let's just see. I just got a black screen.
That
There,
work?
here we go. Yeah, we're good now.
Okay.
Good.
There we go.
Thanks for accommodating the schedule change. Thank you.
No problem.
Over to both of you and David and Wayne. Thank you.
You bet. Yeah. Sorry for the technical difficulties, and thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to join you today. We wanted to take this time to discuss some of the complexities associated with brownfield development in Canada, and then share some of the projects that we've completed that involve solutions for some of those challenges. So we're going to start by discussing typical challenges associated with brownfield development, and then explore motivating factors for brownfield development for both public and private stakeholders. We'll talk a little bit about the size of the opportunity, and then we'll jump into our project examples to share some of our experiences with brownfield development here at Milestone. So mentioning brownfields, most people immediately think of highly contaminated site requiring costly remediation to prepare for it for development. And while that is often the case when we consider the full definition of a brownfield, it's important to remember it can include sites that aren't contaminated and could be underutilized simply due to the perception of challenges associated with a former commercial or industrial site. Now, these perceptions aren't without merit, and they can discourage many people from considering brownfield for development. Cost to remediate can be high. Traditional dig and dump can be expensive exercise and sometimes outstrip the land's value. Complex environmental regulations and municipal land use policies often can slow down the process and mire it in red tape. Despite the best efforts of project teams to evaluate the impacts, it's not always possible to gauge the scope of the issue with 100% accuracy. And an increase in contamination can increase costs to remediate and typically impact the schedule, which will also increase carrying costs. Slow regulatory review and approval can further impact schedule. Potential migration of impacts to adjacent properties can lead to conflicts and reputational risk. And in the most extreme cases, there can be civil liability associated with these sites. So these are just a few of the challenges that can be associated with brownfield development, and they can add up to a daunting barrier. In 2003, the National Roundtable on the Environment and Economy developed a report that made suggestions to try and curb some of these issues. They provided a list of recommendations for governments to enact that would encourage private sector to take a closer look at brownfield development. And while while the 14 recommendations have been slow to gain adoption, the rising value of real estate continues to motivate cities looking to rejuvenate and developers looking for new opportunities. So why would we want to do this? There are many reasons for governments of all levels to be interested in supporting brownfield development. First and foremost is the protection of its citizens and the environment. Restoring and maintaining our environment should be important to all of us, and it's often why there are so many stakeholders involved in brownfield projects. And while protecting citizens and the environment are key drivers for brownfield development, there are additional benefits for public stakeholders. Brownfield development helps revive derelict sites in core city areas. Many municipalities are looking to revive their traditional core city centers and main streets, and a strong brownfield development strategy will almost always be needed as part of a successful revitalization program. Once revitalized, the tax base is restored in key areas by increasing property values and restoring thriving businesses. In turn, these thriving businesses create economic and employment opportunities for the citizens. And when that space is used to develop a shared community space, like a park or a recreational facility, it helps contribute to a thriving local community, all of which helps governments move towards meeting their community and environmental stewardship goals. Goals are often set in consultation with Indigenous groups across Canada. And that's something we want to touch on too, is the importance of including Indigenous groups in brownfield development. It can't be understated. As we will demonstrate in some of our project examples, Indigenous inclusion often plays a key role in both supporting and executing these projects. So in terms of the private sector, I think this chart tells us a lot, and the incentive is well known. Devalued land in prime location provides a lot of potential financial upsides. According to the Canadian Real Estate Association, national home pricing this year increased 13.3% year over year. In Western Canada, we see the price growth in all regions, with BC at 20%, Alberta and Saskatchewan with mid to high single digits, and Manitoba at 10%. And this despite economic conditions and a worldwide pandemic. So despite the obvious financial incentive though, there are other motivating factors for private sector. Positive reputational gains from cleaning up problem sites in neighborhoods, federal, provincial, and municipal incentives for brownfield development in the form of tax incentives, accelerated permitting and loan programs, ready access to existing infrastructure and utilities that can help manage those development costs, reduction in future liability associated with owning the site, including limiting or curtailing off-site migration. And similar to government bodies, brownfield development provides private sector an opportunity to engage local First Nations communities. This benefits the private sector developers as much as public sector stakeholders, and it can help projects gain momentum. The overall contribution to the society and environment is a meaningful and positive one, and I know that can sound flowery, but it's meant to be genuine. Brownfield development can be done properly, and it can have a profound effect on our communities and help create valuable social capital for private and public alike. So how big is this? Unfortunately, there isn't a dedicated brownfield inventory for Canada. While some believe it would be useful, stakeholders have riled against this inventory for a variety of reasons. The stigma of public opinion associated with registering a site as being contaminated, potential exposure to ministry orders from public concerns, liability related with an identified contaminated site, and potential development delays due to public interest group involvement. And while this is understandable, most of these can be alleviated with good communication. Notifying stakeholders early and often in this process of the intended goals of a project can turn potentially fractious public into a supporting one. In my experience, people fill the void of silence, and so this can lead to miscommunication, which isn't good for anyone. Not having a dedicated inventory is unfortunate because such a resource would be useful for public stakeholders so that they can access clear and factual information on the site, its challenges, and the project goals to meet those challenges. An inventory will also help investors identify new opportunities, and it would assist governments to develop policy and assign proper funding to facilitate brownfield development in their communities. So without an inventory, it is hard to estimate the potential size of the brownfield development opportunity in Canada. However, we can look at the Federal Contaminated Site Registry for some guidance. The database covers all of Canada, which is useful. However, it includes many remote sites that would not be suitable for development. And it doesn't include privately owned sites that are in use or haven't been abandoned. Still, many of the identified sites are in desirable locations, and the scale can help us understand the magnitude of the opportunity across Canada. The Federal Contaminated Site Inventory can be found on the Canadian Treasury Board website, and it allows you to filter information by a host of categories. Across Canada, there are an estimated 7,692 active and suspected sites, and these sites are all in various stages of the remediation process. For our discussion, we've broken it down for Western Canada. Sites are identified and prioritized using a host of factors into consideration, including types and quantity of contaminants. High priority sites are ones designated due to the characteristics of the contaminants and the likely chance of risk to public and environment. What is important to note in this slide is the sheer number of sites, indicating a lot of opportunity across all regions of Western Canada for brownfield development. Anyone wanting to take a deeper dive on these locations, the Federal Contaminated Site Registry has a map function that allows you to hunt around major urban centers to help identify these specific locations. So now we'd like to talk a little bit about some of the projects that Milestone's been directly involved in for brownfield work. As noticed, there's some significant challenges of developing brownfield sites. However, the potential benefits and the opportunity will continue to advance in today's increasingly valuable real estate market. Milestone has had great success with working with their clients and their representatives to execute on design solutions and to help innovate where solutions for those problems don't already exist. Our first example is the Zibi site remediation in Gatineau, Quebec, which I'll let Wayne describe for you.
Yeah, thanks, David. The Algonquin and Anishinaabe company, DeConti Construction, in partnership with Milestone, formed DeConti Milestone Incorporated, who acted as the Algonquin liaison general contractor for this unique and world-class project. The Zibi development, known as the Waterfront City, is a 34-acre master planned community that overlooks the Ottawa River and will be home to over 5,000 people and over 6,000 jobs. A community that has residential and commercial space, including a plaza and riverside retail, and nearly 8 acres of riverfront green spaces. DeConti Milestone worked with the Algonquin and Anishinaabe community and led integrated workforces for the ZB project to create a fertile ground for the training and development of skilled trades workers among First Nations people. This project offered a unique way of building bridges to integrate these people into the construction industry and give them training and work opportunities they need to turn into businesses and community leaders. The remediation forms part of a City of Gatineau's Brownfields Rehabilitation Grant and Development Charge Reduction Programs, which offer incentives to encourage redevelopment of post-industrial and heritage properties. The site had 16 acres of potential environmental concern, including former acid storage tanks, former sulfide storage, various sites that contain fuel, oil, and kerosene, PCB storage, and areas of former pulp and paper manufacturing and processing, and the remnants of a great fire of 1900. A remedial action plan was developed which divides the remediation areas into polygons. The intent of the remediation is to incorporate a beneficial reuse of some of the materials during remediation, which involves screening of impacted material to salvage rock and crush the rock for reuse for the construction aspects of the development. As the remediation of the areas advanced, the development also advanced. This presented challenges with a constraining schedule and limited space to manage the contaminated soils, with competing use of property by other contractors and public and private stakeholders, while mitigating environmental impacts to the surrounding urban setting. The remediations on this property included excavation, segregation, screening and transport, and disposal over 100,000 tons of non-hazardous soil, hazardous materials abatement and demolition of former industrial facilities, removal of temporary roads and restoration of permanent site access, installation and reporting of environmental controls and site security measures, controlled breaking, removal and disposal of hydrocarbon impacted bedrock, import, placing and compacting granular backfill, monitoring and tracking and implementing dust control measures. Shoring was also required inside and adjacent to building foundations during excavation. Portions of this work involved remediation of impacted materials within and around historic buildings that were being integrated into the development, so underpinning and shoring was completed to remove the impacted materials and maintain the structural integrity of the building. Further challenges encountered involved increase in contamination soil volumes that were uncovered during remediation work that required more schedule, space, and the additional screening requirements to ensure material would be assessed as a reusable material. Next slide, David. ZB has a bright future and will forever change the Gatineau waterfront. This is a great example of the classic contaminated brownfield converting former industrial land to commercial and residential space. But as we have mentioned, a site doesn't always need to be contaminated to be a brownfield, as in our next project example.
Thanks, Wayne. Yeah, so the Coquitlam First Nation fill site is a great example of a non-contaminated brownfield. This is a 90-acre fill site, primarily located right in the heart of Metro Vancouver, and has been in operation for over 20 years. The Coquitlam are a small Indigenous community with less than 100 active members. This means that they had to rely on third parties to operate this site for them. Unfortunately, many of the early operators were poorly organized contractors that had little interest in proper stewardship of the land. Thanks to progressive community leadership, Coquitlam sourced reliable partners, and today the site is operating efficiently, with Coquitlam playing the primary role in day-to-day operations, employing many of the community members in key positions. The suspect fill, through a rigorous sampling program, has shown that it meets the environmental criteria, and the site is ready to develop areas that have met their fill height. As the site continues to fill, it's opening up more parcels of land for lease and development opportunities, benefiting the entire Coquitlam community. Milestone's involvement with the site has been to develop a transfer facility to receive and vet material prior to deposit on the fill site, taking away what isn't suitable to certified disposal facilities. All our work on site is completed under a joint venture that Milestone has with Coquitlam. Despite its location, third-party developers have been slow to consider this opportunity. Identifying some of the typical brownfield issues can help us understand why. It is a site that has a historical record of unregulated fill, and this poses the threat of potentially costly cleanup. As mentioned, this has been ameliorated by a comprehensive sampling program to review existing fill and the development of a proper screening program for all incoming fill to the site. It also suffers from the perception of complicated Indigenous relationship. Initially open to third-party development, the nation's now looking to develop the site themselves, in part due to the reluctance of private sector investors to support the development, and due to the success of other Indigenous-owned and led developments in the Lower Mainland. Milestone's success at this site stems from our choice to embrace the relationship and not only work with KFN, but develop a joint venture with them to work on many projects around the lower mainland of BC. So while brownfields tend to be landlocked, they can also include waterfront reclamation. Milestone has completed such a project in Hamilton, and this one's Wayne's going to walk us through.
So this is the Randall Reef Sediment Remediation Project. This is a unique project example where remedial design incorporated the consolidation of contaminated sediments into an engineered containment facility while creating a beneficial reuse by creating land that can be developed into an industrial port. Located in the southwest corner of Hamilton Harbor, in the Port of Hamilton, the Randall Reef site is approximately 60 hectares in size. That is equivalent to 120 football fields. This site contains approximately 695,000 cubic meters of sediment contaminated with polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and other toxic chemicals, being the largest PAH contaminated sediment site on the Canadian Great Lakes. Impacted by historic operations, this site has a legacy of past industrial processes dating back to the 1800s. There were multiple sources of contamination, including coal gasification, petroleum refining, steel making, municipal waste, sewage, and overland drainage. Environment Canada served as the project lead, and Public Services Procurement Canada provided technical and construction management and procurement services. Average total PAH concentrations nearly 5,000 ppm with peaks over 73,000 ppm were within the sediment. This project included the design of a remediation plan that included construction of the 6.2 hectare engineered containment facility over the highly contaminated sediment, and then using a combination of hydraulic and mechanical dredging to remove approximately 445,000 cubic meters of contaminated sediment and placing within the ECF. Next slide, David. The ECF is made of a double steel sheet pile walls with outer walls driven to depths of up to 24 meters into the underlying sediment. The inner wall is sealed, creating an impermeable barrier. Following the dredging, the sediment will then be covered by a multi-layered environmental cap. The dredge of the contaminated sediments also involved treating and dewatering the ECF to balance the input into the ECF. This involved the design build of a water treatment plant that would match the input of the dredging and balance the water level within the ECF. We utilized the active flow process from Veolia, which is a sand ballasted settling process designed to remove suspended solids in water. The water treatment plant was designed to treat high TSS up to 3,000 milligrams per liter and treating PAHs and metals. The process is a high rate coagulation, flocculation, and sedimentation process that treated water at 680 cubic meters an hour on a 24/7 basis. The dredging was followed by thin layer capping of marginally contaminated sediment and isolation capping of the Stelco intake outfall channel sediments. This involved a reactive core mat, installing 1,270 square meters of subaqueous organic clay mat known as the Tectoseal, and installing an amended sand cap with a sand cap mixture having a minimum 3% of total organic carbon, and also installing an amended sand cap with armoring stone to protect the capping installations. Phase 3 of this project will be construction of a multi-layered environmental cap to cover the sediment within the ECF, accompanied with consolidation and dewatering of the sediments. Following this will be construction of several layers of materials, which include aggregates of various sizes and topped by surface asphalt. Next slide, David. Upon completion of this project, the Hamilton-Oshawa Port Authority will accept ownership of this facility and be responsible for monitoring, maintaining, and developing the site as port facilities. The facility is expected to have a 200-year lifespan. One of the largest negative factors for brownfields is the cost. Randall Reef displayed a unique solution to this problem by sequestering the contaminants on site. Our next project example highlights another option to reduce costs by treating material directly on site. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Wayne. Yeah. So the Marvel project is another great example of utilizing on-site solutions to control costs from traditional remediation techniques. When we first arrived on this site, it had pooling tar on the surface, creating a huge liability and danger to the public. The project used a process of enhanced thermal conduction to treat about 36,000 tons of hydrocarbon impacted soils on site. This meant that the treated soil could then be used as backfill, so this reduced costs for transport, disposal, and obviously purchase a backfill. It also had the challenge of an urban setting in close proximity to both residential and commercial spaces. It's right on the edge of Whitehorse. This ensured a host of concerned stakeholders that were heavily vested in this project. But thanks to treating the material on site, offsite transport was kept to a minimum, and it went a long way to reducing the direct impact to the locals. While the project didn't call for it, Milestone engaged the local First Nation and utilized their resources to garner their support for the project within the community. The process itself was very successful, and it brought levels of site contamination below the intended target. By doing so, Milestone managed to further enhance the development opportunities for this site in the future. So this is a great example of alternative in situ remediation techniques that can be employed to reduce project costs and provide positive benefit to the external stakeholders. Other in situ technologies that can realize similar benefits include chemical injections, liquid and vapor extraction systems, impermeable or reactive barriers, and soil mixing. This includes soil mixing to stabilize using something like Portland cement, or mixing in a reactive substance, as we demonstrate on our next example.
So this next example is the Sydenham Pearl Brownfield Remediation Project in Brantford, Ontario. The site area is approximately 2.4 hectares and is mostly surrounded by a residential neighborhood. 22 Sydenham Street directly abuts the CN rail line on the north side, and both properties are bisected by a section of Sydenham Street that ends at the CN property. The City of Brantford undertook background investigations which confirmed contaminants in both soil and groundwater on the site. The city remediated the site to permit development for residential and parkland uses through 2015 and 2016. Phase 2 of this project, the remediation took about 8 weeks to complete, included removal of underground storage tanks, excavation and off-site disposal of petroleum, hydrocarbons, and soil, in situ soil mixing to break down volatile organic compounds in soil and groundwater via abiotic reduction. The soil mixing strategy employed at the site, which is designed to ensure adequate distribution of the zero-valent iron within the soils while minimizing the creation of odors and preventing off-site adverse impacts to those neighboring residential properties. Milestone selected the Lang Tool Company soil mixing equipment dual-axis blender to provide a homogeneous mixture of the contaminated material and the reagent, a versatile additive delivery system, and an integrated GPS system, ensuring the reagent was delivered in the correct quantity in the correct location. Due to the close proximity of the residential properties and the project requirements to ensure there were no off-site adverse impacts, an air quality monitoring program was implemented consisting of VOC monitoring, particulate matter monitoring, noise monitoring, and a meteorological station. VOC monitoring program focused on the period where the excavation and soil mixing would be occurring, where the VOC releases would be expected to occur. Phase 3 of this property included the soil capping and berm construction and greening of the property. Installation of a soil cap was a requirement of the Ministry of Environment of Climate Change in accordance with the risk assessment completed for these properties. Milestone Environmental Contracting completed soil capping and berm construction on this project. Back to you, David.
Our last example is the Shipyard Lot number 5 site remediation in North Vancouver. It's another great example of a brownfield site. Milestone was contracted to remove soil contaminated from historical shipbuilding, so the impacts included hydrocarbons, metals, and lead contamination from lead paint removal, which required stabilizing on site prior to transport for disposal. This project is located in the heart of Lonsdale Quay, which is an extremely busy area in North Van, surrounded by residential and commercial. It's situated near the Seabus terminal, which ferries people from North Van to Vancouver, and is a hub of activity that required extra care for removing material from the site. While stakeholder concerns can be complicated, sometimes it's something as simple as roadway management, and it can be an important factor. And I'm not just talking about traffic control, but truck routes to avoid congestion and working hours can all impact locals as well. You have to consider cleanliness and ensure contractors keep up. In the case of this particular project, we done that by, it was done during the wet season. And so road maintenance was a key issue for the locals and a concern of the surrounding public. So we installed a truck wash that would treat the water prior to discharge. And this helped ensure minimal impact to the surrounding public and kept everybody on our side. This is the concept design for this. And with the remediation complete, the shipyard is ready to be developed into an important part of the vibrant Lonsdale Quay. So we wanted to share just a few resources with you. You can find a lot of information online about brownfield development for your specific area, but these are 3 key resources that we note. If you're interested in finding out more about brownfield development, the resources provide a great information and support. Canadian Brownfield Network is a key resource for brownfield development. It should be your first stop for information and support. Strong advocates for brownfield development across Canada, they regularly engage with all levels of government to make brownfield development a key issue of concern. They hold events, information centers, host the Brownie Awards, which were just held, provide geographically specific information to both private and public interests. The next one is the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. It provides another good resource for information on brownfields and supports local governments in the planning and can provide funding for brownfield projects in their communities. They've developed brownfield roadmaps for each province and territory. And these roadmaps help support both private sector and municipal governments navigate the challenges that brownfield developments can present. And lastly, in Alberta, the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association is a strong advocate for brownfield development and provides a great database of information specific to the Alberta brownfield market. Brownfield sites can pose a broad range of challenges to a prospective developer. However, the many benefits they can bring to our community shouldn't be underestimated. As real estate prices continue to climb and greenfield development sites dwindle, development of brownfields will become a necessity. Governments, encouraged by advocacy groups, will need to expand their support programs for private sector developers, and contractors like Milestone will be ready to help develop unique solutions to bring the site to a developable state, turning something like this that you see here into this. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you found it useful. I think we maybe have a minute. I'm not sure, Joe, for questions if there's any.
Yeah, definitely. If there's any questions for Wayne and David, please type them in the question box, or as always, their contact info is on the screen. Feel free to reach out to them. Give people a second to type anything, see if there's any questions. A very quiet crowd today. Looks like there's no questions for you guys. So thanks again, Wayne and David, and appreciate the support and appreciate you doing this. And we'll move on to our final presentation today.
You bet. Thanks, Joe.
Okay. Now to Joanne from GHD. She's going to speak to us on evaluating the NSZD via the biogenic heat method of complex sites. Why doesn't my data look like the published data? Joanne, did you get the link?
I think so. See if that works.
Sure does. Perfect. Oh, yep.
Okay, hold on. Are you seeing the correct screen?
Says welcome in black.
Yes.
Yep.
Without everything else. Okay.
Nothing else. Yep, you're good.
All right. Thanks. So, well, thank you. And I thanks everyone for sticking around. I think this is the last talk of the day. So we will get right to it. I missed part of Tom Pelaya's earlier talk that was also on NSZD. I think that he was doing a lot more of the sort of a nice introduction to what NSZD is and some of the background evidence, why people are trusting the data and starting to use it more. This one is a little bit more of a detailed talk into one of the specific measurement techniques, was what we'll end up going through. Okay, So as Joe mentioned, it's evaluating NSCD via the biogenic heat method at complex sites. Or of course, and I'm sure other people have this issue as well, but why doesn't my data ever look like the published data? I think I get given the fun sites where this seems to happen a lot. So I do a lot of deep dives into the data analysis. So just a quick, here's the agenda for this talk. I'll do a very brief overview of NSCD, probably a repeat of some of Tom's, but for anyone who didn't hear that, it'll be a quick overview. I'll talk about the most common measurement methods that people use for the sites at this stage in applying it at sites. But most of the talk will be about the biogenic heat method, and then we'll look at data from a specific site before a wrap-up discussion. And this is just an interesting photo that is courtesy of eFlux LLC, and this is just from a photo that shows bubbles that are, Tom mentioned the direct LNAPL biodegradation that's occurring, and this is a photo of bubbles, the biogas bubbles that can actually be seen at times during the in soil collection. So it's the direct outgassing of the carbon dioxide and the methane from the pore spaces adjacent to LNAPL at a site. All right, so let's go through a quick overview of NSCD. So natural source zone depletion is just an umbrella term that captures all the different petroleum degradation processes that are occurring in the subsurface that reduce the LNAPL mass. So that's going to include the dissolution of LNAPL constituents into groundwater, which is traditional monitor natural attenuation that I think a lot of people are familiar with. It also includes volatilization of LNAPL constituents into the vadose zone and the direct biodegradation by microbial contact or the enzymatic activity. So all of those processes make up this NSCD process. So this occurs in the saturated zone and the vadose zone. And the nice thing about NSCD is that it acts on all of the LNAPL body. So not just the mobile or migrating LNAPL body, but also the residual LNAPL that can be remaining at the site after remedial activities have occurred. So the net effect is that you get degradation of all of the different hydrocarbons in LNAPL, and that includes the long chain compounds as well as the short chain compounds. So these processes all play an important role in stability of the LNAPL body, and it's thought that that's part of what helps, that this is what helps stabilize that LNAPL body after the source has been removed or there's no longer a head on the LNAPL that's causing the migration. And then it continues to degrade any remaining LNAPL at the site. All right, it's slow to change here. So, okay. So looking at these processes, methanogenesis typically dominates the degradation processes. So this is an anaerobic process that's occurring in the saturated zone and the capillary fringe. It generates a significant amount of methane and CO2 gases, which migrate upward, represented by the green and red arrows in the diagram on the left. So they migrate upward into the vadose zone, and this is the area of methane oxidation. And this zone is the one that's going to be important for the rest of this presentation, looking at the biogenic heat method, is that methane oxidation zone in the vadose zone. So the LNAPL components don't have to be very soluble or volatile to biodegrade, since the microbes will find them as long as they're there. And at most sites, it's been found that these vapor-based LNAPL losses are 2 orders of magnitude greater than the dissolved phase or the aqueous LNAPL losses that we've been measuring for a long time. The majority of the carbon dioxide that's generated from the degradation reactions will be released upward through the vadose zone and to the ground surface. And that's an important part of the process for some of the other measurements that are typical measurements that people use. All right, so let's look at some of the measurement methods. Okay, so for the CO2 that is at the surface, we've got a couple different vapor phase methods. So surface CO2 efflux can be measured with a dynamic closed chamber, or also known as a DCC. And it can also be measured with something called CO2 traps. So the top photo is the DCC method, and the bottom photo shows you the passive CO2 flux trap method. So the DCC method is a short-term method. So you're just out on site and you are just measuring for a few minutes in each location. After there is some setup for it, but it just gives you a snapshot of NSCD rates at the site at the time that you're doing the measurements. Sometimes this is used as a screening level data so that you can decide where to do these CO2 traps. The CO2 trap method provides a longer term method, so it's averaging the CO2 efflux over several weeks' time. So an additional method that uses for vapor phase is you can use a soil gas method that looks at the subsurface gas profiles for oxygen, CO2, and methane. So this method is performed by measuring these gases down a monitoring well and looking at these vertical profiles for the different gases to look at how they change. Again, this is going to be a short-term or snapshot method. You can use dedicated installations to get a longer-term average for these measurements. For all of these methods, you do have to do background corrections performed. And the nice thing about the CO2 trap method is that these CO2 traps, you collect the data and you send them to the lab, but they have a built-in site-specific background correction for each trap. For something like the DCC or the soil gas method, the gradient method, you are going to use locations outside of your LNAPL body to determine what the background CO2 flux would be, or the background soil gas, see what that looks like outside of the LNAPL body and use that for your corrections. Okay, so one thing that based on these methods, they either can't be used or not going to be as reliable at sites that are considered more complex sites. So sites that have an impervious impervious ground cover. So obviously for both the DCC method and the CO2 flux method, you have to have pervious ground surface cover. So that can be, so that these methods may not be useful at a lot of sites if you're looking at retail stations or sites where you've got the asphalt or concrete covers. Also, the other thing that people find is that if you've got a lot of fine-grained soils, that thick clay layers may restrict or they're going to affect that vertical flow of the CO2 to the surface. So that's going to affect what you see in those measurements. So these methods aren't as good as some of those sites. All right, so the biogenic heat method is another typical, pretty common method for measuring NSCD rates at a site. So this method involves measuring temperature changes that are associated with that methane oxidation. So that process, the methane oxidation process, is an exothermic process, and as you can see in the diagram on the right, with methane oxidizing in that zone, what you end up with is you end up with heat conduction to the surface as well as heat conduction. So you've got heat that's rising off of that methane oxidation zone. Some of it's going to be traveling up to the surface and some of it's going to be traveling down, so above and below that methane oxidation zone. So because of that, we can use that in analyzing the data. So again, we want to measure temperatures inside the LNAPL body and compare those to temperatures that are outside the LNAPL body. And we look for these anomalies in the temperature profiles, which just end up being on the order of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. So it's not a huge change that we're looking for. The methane oxidation zone, it can be near the water table or it can be higher, just depends on the rate of methane and VOC production or whether or not you have shallow soil impacts. And it is possible that you can have LNAPL impacts that are too close to the surface to have enough actual space for this methane oxidation to occur. So that can happen at sites if it's really shallow. The results of the temperature profiles, once we collect that data, these results are going to be converted to degradation rates using heats of reaction and assumed stoichiometry. And I'll show you just a little bit more of that. More details on both of these methods can be found in guidance that is becoming more common. So ITRC, the Interstate Technology and Regulatory Council, and then also in the CRC CARE documents guidance that are based in Australia. All right, so for the biogenic heat method, a little bit more detail. So for this method, we want to determine subsurface temperature profiles throughout the LNAPL area. We want to make sure that we're taking these temperature measurements throughout the methane oxidation zone in each of the locations. So it's good if we have an idea of where that's going to be, but if not, then if your site allows for it, you can just collect from the surface down to the water table to make sure that you're not going to miss anything in that zone. The background corrected temperature profiles will allow the observation of the temperature anomaly that we're looking for that's associated with the LNAPL degradation process that is indicated in the plot in the middle of the diagram. And at sites where you may not have an accessible background area, with this method, you can model subsurface background temperatures and use that in your correction as your correction factor, and I'll show you an example of that. So for these measurements, we can use thermocouples are one option that will provide a snapshot of the NSCD degradation rates. So in working in existing wells, you can use thermocouples. You can also use temperature loggers can be installed into the monitoring wells for longer term averages. You can also just have a dedicated installation of temperature loggers in locations around the site. So all of those methods are possible ways of collecting these temperature profiles. So from the CRC CARE technical report, here's an example of data that was collected, and the plot on the far left that's in blue, if you can tell, is the background location, and then the two on the right are the ones for collected in one of the monitoring wells. And this so the plot itself goes from about 21.5 degrees Celsius to almost 26. And all of these plots are on the left is the depth, and the surface is at the top, and it's increasing going down so that it represents what you would see in the well. All right, so we've got our background temperature profile, and we've got two temperature profiles as they're measured in the well. To correct for the background, we simply just subtract the background temperatures from the well profiles. And this is an example of the results for MW24, which was the one on the right in the previous slide. So in order to calculate NSCD rates, what we're looking for is we're looking at this temperature profile. This anomaly here is associated with that methane oxidation zone. So what we're looking at is the slope above and going up and going down, so that we can calculate these heats of the heat flux up and down away from the methane oxidation zone. So So we take, to find those temperature gradients, it's just the change in temperature divided by the change in the vertical distance, or delta T over delta Z. And then calculating the heat flux, we just multiply we multiply these up and down gradients by the thermal conductivity of the soil or the rock that's at the site. And typically what we do to find thermal conductivities is we just use reference material for the thermal properties of the soil or rock, unless you actually know what's at your site. And then the final step in a CD rate to estimate the rates is to divide that total heat flux by the heat of reaction, which you can find this again in reference material. Sweeney and Reary in 2014 is one of the, I think the basic one that's used. And that rate is 48 kilojoules per gram of hydrocarbon. All right, so that's the real technical information for calculating it, but you can see that what we're looking for, so you need that when we're looking at these temperature profiles, being able to determine what that slope is the first step of calculating your rates. All right, so let's look at this site. And so the site that I'm going to use, it's an Australian site. It is a former bulk fuel depot. It's located adjacent to a rail line that was used for unloading fuel and for transferring fuel to adjacent fuel depots. El Napol has been observed in the wells, in addition to having impacted soil and groundwater. The releases have been assumed to be from above and below ground piping. So the just historical releases over time that are somewhat unknown. The typical soils at the site include a couple of meters of clay or sandy clay that's underlain by up to 7 meters of stiffer clay. And then in some of the locations, there's sand or clay sand or sandy clay soil. And so at this site, the biogenic heat data was collected using iButtons, so temperature loggers. It was collected in 6 different wells. We're going to look at 4 out of those. And the data was collected over about a month's time. So April of 2021 was when this data was collected. All right, so in the plot on the left, you can see the temperature profiles as they're measured at the site. At this particular site, we ended up doing a modeled background. We're still looking at some of the data, and there may be a site well that will work also as a background well. So we'll be able to compare the results using both of these methods, but the modeled background is in the red. And again, we're looking at the depth from the surface at the top going down. Typically, when we're doing these measurements, so at the top 2 meters of data, a lot of times we just don't even collect the data there, or we disregard it if someone does collect that data and we're analyzing it because of surface temperature effects. And then on the right, you can see that these are the corrected temperature profiles once we subtract out that background. So one thing that we did notice was looking at the iButton data, that we could see that in all of the 2 meter locations, we could see surface temperature effects. Since this is collected over a month, we could see that. That's one thing that you won't be able to tell as easily if you're using like thermocouples where you're just getting a snapshot. You won't know that. So it's better to make sure that you're not including anything that's too close to the surface. So these are the corrected profiles, and as you can see, they're not quite as straightforward as what we see in the guidance, where we just have that nice one peak, except for maybe MW8, which most of that is 0, and that's not even a degree of a change. But it's obvious what we need to use for MW8, but it's not quite as obvious why we're getting these the types of profiles we are for the other 3. And there's a peak near the bottom, but is that what we should use? Why are we having these, why are we getting this decrease in temperature at the top? And so just trying to make sure that we are using data that we trust. So one thing that we did do is I went back just to make sure that the procedure where everybody collected, when the data was collected, that everyone followed the right procedure and that we didn't have any issues there. Looking again at the loggers, make sure there's no issues with the loggers, and nothing was apparent. So so the next thing I did was I remembered that there had been an earlier presentation last year that I had seen where someone was looking at a site that had alternating sand and clay layers at the site. And so they had determined that in the sand layers, they were getting peaks at a couple of points throughout throughout their profiles. And they realized that those peaks fell within the sand layers at the site. So so I decided to take a closer look at the geology at each of these well locations, which a lot of times if you just have a typical profile, you don't have to go into that much detail. But we wanted to try to use this data to see if we could figure out what was going on. All right, so here's two of them. This is for MW4 and MW8. And if we look at what happened, the soil at the site, again, I had to look at to see how the soil data, the boring logs, what kind of drilling was done to look at whether or not we could trust the descriptions for the soil logs. So some of these, we just knew that we didn't have, or some of these wells were installed so long ago, we didn't actually have good data for it, or even couldn't even find the boring logs. So we know that at the site that there's an approximate transition from clay to sand around 7 meters. And so for MW4, that's on the left, that's what we were just looking at that. And we know that's an approximate depth. So if we use that as an approximate depth, then it maybe starts to make sense that once we move into the sandy zone, that's where we're really seeing that methane oxidation, the heat resulting from that methane oxidation process. And that falls pretty similar in MW8. Both of these happen to fall at 9 meters where we're seeing that peak. The soil in MW8 was we had a little better descriptions, and it goes from clay to a cemented sand back to clay. So most of that's in clay. So we did use that whole peak that's on the right to determine the NSED, because it does seem that when we are looking at these sites, if it's all in clay and you don't have these transitions from one layer to another, that we will still see the biogenic processes that are occurring there, but we know the rates are lower in clay than they are in other soil types. So those are the slopes that we used for those two wells. And then the next two wells, we've got MW22 and MW23. Again, we have the similar thing in MW22. It looks very similar to 4. So in this well, we knew that the approximate transition is up higher. It's about 7 feet. And so again, once we get into the sandier soil is below that transition line, and we again see a nice peak that's above the water table. MW23, we are going from a silty clay into clay and back to a sandier soil. So we have so the question, do you use this whole line to determine your NSED rates, or do you just start at that transition? And one thing to consider is that in this case, we're looking at the slope of the line, and the slope is the same whether we use this whole depth or whether we just use this below this transition line into the sandy clay. So we're going to get the same results either way. So that's what we used for those. And so here's some results, and then just to show you sort of where these are located. For MW4 and 8, so all of the results that we had were less than 800 US gallons per acre per year. So ranging from 121 to 800 at the site. And if you're used to liters per meter squared per year, that's falling from 0.113 to 0.713 liters per meter squared per year at the site. So, and the 4 wells you can see at the top, for this particular site, we are looking more along the property boundary. Down below those highlighted wells, you can see some, I think you can probably see some wells are in purple, and those are some of the system wells. The darker blue is the current El Napo area. So we're sort of looking outside of the current El Napo area, but you can also see that there are former depots all around the site. So it makes sense that we were getting some results that those results are not considered to be really high. They're on the low end, but we are at a clay site, and we are looking sort of on the boundary of where the El Napo had previously, or where the El Napo is currently. So we do think that NSCD is occurring at the site, and that we can see that in our in these results and in the temperature profiles. You may be wondering why are we going to spend time at sites trying to use this? I think that sometimes it's sometimes people will think if it's clay site that you can't do that. But we tend to work on some sites where part of the closure process is doing the NSCD evaluation, doing that assessment to see if NSCD is occurring, because they do want to see that before we can get closure. So we do actually have some regulatory agencies that are looking at that. So we need to do some kind of measurements here, and the biogenic heat method is the one that makes the most sense when you're looking at these complex sites. So we're continuing to do that as much as at these sites, and just trying to see if we can make sense out of the data, and we trying to make sure that the data makes sense, and that we have good data when we're coming up with these numbers. So just as a wrap up, I mean, so we do think that we are identifying NSCD processes at these complex sites, so these fine-grained soils and with an impermeable surface cover. Again, your site geology may be necessary to interpret your profiles. And I didn't mention this before, but I think using the temperature anomaly in the limited portion of the well may be a conservative approach to determining NSCD rates. Sometimes we think that, but as you could see in that one well, using just one portion of the temperature profile, it would lead to the same result as using the rest of it, because we're looking at the slopes. That's the important part of the profile, is you need the slope. It's not necessary how long it is. And as I said, we're continuing to analyze some of the thermocouple and temperature logger data at complex sites. And if anyone else has attempted this at sites or has anything to discuss, I'd be happy to talk about it. I have my information on the right. I am a remote worker, so I'm not actually in any of the GHD offices. So I've got my phone number and my email, and I am in the US. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Joanne. Any questions for Joanne? Just as we wait to see if there's any questions, just a reminder, I'll be sending out a link later today with a link to this video, along with a video of the presentation that we had to skip over, and a link to the presentations. Hopefully I'll get that out later today or first thing tomorrow morning to everyone. Joanne, doesn't look like there's any questions at this point. Her contact info is on the screen as she mentioned, so feel free to reach out directly to her. With that concludes our RemTech webinar series. Thanks to Core Environmental Consulting for sponsoring today's webinar. Great appreciation to all the presenters over the 3 days that presented over the last 3 weeks, all 24 presenters. Really appreciate the support, and a big thank you to everyone who joined, signed up, and supported ESA and these presentations and took the time out of their days to listen to them. With that, we'll sign off. Wish everyone Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, all the best, and stay safe. Take care.